Book 2, Dianetic Processing. Chapter 1, The Basic Principles of Processing. In practice in Dianetics, the auditor is doing a very simple thing. He is recovering theta, which has become confused with mest by reason of physical pain and emotional shock. He is, by Dianetic processing, converting n theta to theta. A fundamental axiom of Dianetics is that life is formed by theta compounding with mest to make a living organism. Life is theta plus mest. Another axiom is that theta conquers mest by first becoming enturbulated with it, and then withdrawing, possessed of some of the laws of mest, and returning over the mest for an orderly conquest. Another axiom is that theta, in its conquest of mest, has followed the cycle of contact, growth, decay, and death, repeated over and over, theta each time using the data gained during the cycle to better adapt the organism for the further conquest of mest. Theta is thought, an energy of its own universe, analogous to energy in the physical universe, but only occasionally paralleling electromagnetic gravitic laws. The three primary components of theta are affinity, reality, and communication. Theta has the strange power of animating and directing mest, and bringing it into an orderly, mobile, and self-perpetuating unit known to us as a life organism. Theta and mest in a disorderly collision bring about enturbulation in both the theta and the mest, which actually changes or reverses the polarity of the theta and the mest. This reversed polarity permits the rejection of theta by n-mest and of mest by n-theta, so that death can ensue and a new organism can be begun. Theta, acting upon mest with affinity, communication, and reality, takes on an aspect known as reasoning or understanding. All mathematics can be derived from ARC acting upon mest. Theta may have considerable residual knowledge of its own, but the knowledge in which an organism is interested is information concerning theta and mest laws as applied to the organism, and each and every organism develops in the ratio that it utilizes and understands these laws. In the cycle of the organism from conception to death, theta and mest are many times brought together in disorderly collision. This creates the phenomenon known as physical pain. Perception of threats to survival and dwindling position on the tone scale charge up these moments of physical pain as a mechanism to force the organism into, at first, greater survival activities, and then, these failing, into death activities in order to free the theta from the mest to begin a new cycle. The break point where the organism is no longer driven upward toward survival but begins to go downward toward death is 2.0 on the tone scale. Death has been a vital mechanism in theta's conquest of mest, since in no other way could the theta become sufficiently unenturbulated to be able to use the information received through enturbulence to create and construct new organisms or new species. Inevitably, through this evolution, theta, seeking, according to theory, wider and wider conquest of mest, would construct an organism by which force of reason could actively handle large quantities of mest. Man is such an organism. No lesser organism can rationally arrange any large quantity of mest exterior to the organism, although many lesser organisms have genetic habit patterns which do permit the handling and altering of small amounts of mest. All learning springs from disorderly enturbulences where theta has impinged too suddenly and sharply upon mest. All reasoning is done by freed theta, returning over the mest for an orderly conquest, utilizing the lessons learned in the disorderly conquest. This applies not only to the formation of organisms, but to all adventures of man, according to observation. It is possible that Dianetics, if these theories continue to prove correct as they have in the past, forms an evolutionary bridge which minimizes death as a mechanism for new learning and conquest, and maximizes the conversion of n theta to theta, or disorderly experience to reason, within one lifespan. Should this prove to be the case, the acceleration of conquest of mest by man should be very marked. And indeed, at this time it can be observed that through a past lack of knowledge of the humanities, his social orders have been for some time on a dwindling spiral, even though his knowledge of the physical laws increased. Man, according to these theories, could be said to have learned a great deal about the physical universe without learning enough about theta. An interesting series of experiments recently done by the Foundation seems to bear out the theory that heightened reasonability is contained in theta which has been newly recovered from an turbulence with MEST. Individuals were given psychometry for a few minutes in order to measure their existing intelligence. They were then sent back down the track into an engram by an auditor, and the engram was thoroughly restimulated. Immediately afterwards, the engram not reduced, these experimental subjects were ordered to do a second psychometry. In this condition of stress, the second test was taken and it was found that the score on the second test was uniformly higher than that gained on the first test. Considerable additional experimentation must be undertaken, and these results are very far from conclusive, but they would seem to indicate validity in some of the theta-MEST postulates. Other explanations can, of course, be found for the results of these experiments. However, the theta-MEST postulates have permitted new Dianetic processes to be derived, and have markedly increased the ease of processing and have decreased the length of time necessary to bring about a Dianetic release. Further, the theta-MEST postulates shed much light on the third dynamic, and with them it was possible for me to bring into being a new technology of groups, which when tested on pilot projects with groups was found to have a uniform workability. To learn anything about MEST, theta must become interbulated with it. But to utilize the changes in it caused by the interbulation, the theta must be freed from MEST in order to accomplish a reasonable conquest of further MEST. Death has been an answer of sorts, but is not satisfactory to the unit organism. Dianetic processing offers a much less drastic theta recovery. The theta-MEST theory, as it applies to the increased reasonability of theta, which has been recovered from n-theta, is pronounced in the many psychometries gathered by the Foundation. These show swift rises in intelligence and marked betterment of personality in ratio to the amount of processing done. As locks, secondaries, and engrams are reduced, more and more free theta could be said to exist in the individual. Inspecting a time track at the beginning of a case, one ordinarily finds many occluded areas about which no reasoning can be done. It could be said that these areas, as in engrams themselves, contain n-theta. Any of several processes which can free this n-theta and convert it into theta will increase the reasonability of the individual, as witnessed by many long series of psychometric tests taken before and after Dianetic processing. The restoration of recall of the areas hitherto occluded, in that the data contained in these areas is valuable as experience and information, could be said therefore to increase the health and reason of the individual. But the recovery of the theta, which could be said to lie in these areas as n-theta, could also be postulated to increase the reason of the individual. The tone scale is actually a chart of the ratio of free theta and n-theta in the individual. Above the 2.0 line, the individual could be said to have more theta than n-theta. Below the point 2.0, the individual could be said to have more n-theta than theta. Simply by converting n-theta to theta, the auditor can cause the individual to rise on the tone scale. It will readily be seen that the ideal condition would be all theta recovered and no n-theta remaining in existence in the individual. The attainment of this ideal is called in Dianetics a cleared state. This would be at this time the end goal of processing. Just how often it can be completely attained by skilled or unskilled auditors is open to question. That it can be neared and that cases grow markedly better under processing is not open to question, since regardless of any wonder about the cleared state, none who have associated with the Foundation or who have practiced Dianetics, with any knowledge at all, have any smallest doubt of the ability of Dianetic processing to improve cases 100% more than was ever before possible. If clears cannot be created easily and swiftly, Dianetic processing is still very far from invalidated. Actually, clears have been and are being produced, but their total potentialities remain relatively unexplored. The Dianetic release is more understandable than the clear, and has been produced and studied in sufficient numbers to admit of little doubt about the desirability and stability of the state. This is a nearer and more easily obtainable goal. The simple alleviation of pain, worry, and general unhappiness is routine to the Dianetic auditor. He can accomplish these goals in anything from a few hours to a few weeks on most pre-clears. These are much more easily obtained goals and are quite ordinary in the vicinity of the Foundation. so that these, which some say might have been considered miracles 2 years ago, hardly cause comment. Occasionally, some Foundation auditor is startled into advertising a result to his fellow auditors in a processing unit, but these successes are generally taken for granted. The most recent case under casual comment at the Foundation was an elderly woman who had been bedridden for 16 years and who was sufficiently disabled with locomotor ataxia to be unable to take a single step. She was processed for 4 weeks by a student as an extracurricular activity, and at the end of this time had lost her symptoms and was walking by herself. However, this case was rendered interesting to Foundation personnel mainly because of the charm and gratitude of the lady. A considerable study of the production of clears is in progress at this time. The most pertinent factor which has come to light is the evident requirement that the auditor must be higher on the tone scale than his pre-clear in order to produce good results. Just as we have the ratio of theta to n theta establishing the sanity or insanity of the individual, so do we have the ratio of free theta in the auditor to the free theta n theta ratio in the pre-clear, establishing the swiftness with which the n theta can be uninterpolated in the pre-clear. An examination of this theory will demonstrate that there are 3 valid processes. The first and the simplest of these processes consists of changing the environment of the pre-clear. His old environment possibly contains many restimulative objects and persons, so that his free theta is in continual turbulence by reason of the restimulation. Shifting the pre-clear to an unrestimulative environment permits him to settle out, which is to say, permits n theta to settle down in his reactive mind and convert in some small portion to free theta. Part of the environmental change process would be, of course, the bettering of affinity, reality, and communication in the environment of the pre-clear. This by itself could produce a rise in his tone. Falling in love, being an increase of affinity, can make a well man out of a sick man. Being rejected or falling out of love, being a decrease of affinity, can make a sick man out of a well man. Bettering a person's communication, even if it only consists of a new pair of glasses, will also raise his tone. Validating his realities which were in question can raise his tone. All these things could be considered environmental changes. A special part of environmental change would be changes in health by reason of nutrition or better living conditions. This process must not be overlooked, since it has been our experience that some pre-clears who were not doing as well as could have been desired were deficient in their nutrition. The pre-clear who lives on coffee and sandwiches does not do as well during processing as one who has an adequate and balanced ration with proper vitamin supplements. Good physical exercise can by itself markedly increase the individual's position on the tone scale, and a whole therapy to aid psychotics could easily be worked out along the lines of exercise alone. Probably the worst thing that can happen to a psychotic is to be placed in the atmosphere normally provided for him by the state. Only a sane, healthy environment where he gets proper exercise and where he has unrestimulative individuals around him could do much to improve his condition. The psychotic will sometimes improve if he is given command over more mest, and indeed a fundamental in the production of psychosis is denying the individual a command over mest. No better method of tailor-making psychotics could be devised than the usual institution, and it is probable that if the normal person were placed in such an institution, in such an atmosphere, he would become psychotic. Indeed, the incidence of psychosis overtaking attendants and psychiatrists in attendance in such institutions is alarmingly high, a sign which one would have thought would have meant something some time since. This is second only to psychosurgery and shock treatment in the worsening of psychotics in a psychotic state. Rather than give psychotics such treatment in sanitariums, it would be far kinder to kill them immediately and completely, and not partially, as does psychosurgery and electric shock. The second process, which is valid in producing results, is education. Education, if defined as the process of making new data available to the individual and causing his mind to attend to and use that data, itself brings reason into the case. Education usually provides new areas of concentration in the environment of the individual and translates many of his unknowns into knowns. Unreason could be classed in 2 categories: too wide a zone of attention and too fixed a zone of attention. In the first, the mind wanders over large areas, unable to select pertinent data. In the second, Where the mind is fixed, it cannot wander far enough to find pertinent data. In neither case can the mind resolve the problem about which it is concerned due to the absence of data. Superstition is an effort, for lack of education, to find pertinent data in too wide a zone or to fix the attention upon irrelevant data. Personal experience in one's environment gives one what might be called a personal education. A man has become embroiled with mess, has freed himself, solved problems, has become embroiled again, has drawn back and solved problems anew, so that he has accumulated a fund of personal data about his task of living. Education might be said to be the process by which the individual is given the accumulated data of a long span of culture. It can, no less validly than personal experience, solve many of his problems. And so, free theta, confronted by too many problems, can just by this become uninterpolated. Good education can in this way convert some of the n-theta of an individual into theta, with a consequent rise on the tone scale. A very sharp proviso, however, must here be entered. Authoritarian teaching, by which the facts are impressed upon the individual and his self-determinism in his utilization of those facts is suppressed, can reduce the free theta in the individual by involving it in a fixed state in the memory bank. Theta is reason. Fixed theta is n-theta. Many a man with a college education, hammered home by authoritarian professors, has been reduced so far down the tone scale that he behaves in life more or less like an automaton. His self-determinism and hence his persistence and ability to handle responsibility are so reduced as to unfit him for his role in life. Further, concentrating on educational processes past the mid-teens, after which a person should be solving problems of living, has an inhibitive effect upon the mind. An artist specifically is hindered by authoritarian education, since his must be the highest self-determinism if his work is to have any value. Authoritarian education has more or less the same effect upon the individual as hypnotism, depressing him down the tone scale. And indeed, at this time, most education is leveled as hypnotic commands rather than invitations to reason. An education which invites reason and the comparison of taught data with the real world can raise the individual on the tone scale. The third process which can be considered valid in raising the individual on the tone scale is individual processing, by which is meant any method which will turn his n-theta into theta by addressing him as an individual. It seems to be one of the characteristics of theta that when the theta present exceeds to a very high degree the n-theta present, the n-theta will tend to disinterbulate and become theta. In other words, if we considered these matters in terms of polarity and energy, a positive field, if sufficiently strong, would inhibit and then convert a negative field near it. A very large magnet placed close to a small magnet will change the poles of the small magnet. When a very large amount of n-theta is placed in the vicinity of a lesser amount of theta, the theta may rapidly become n-theta. When theta and n-theta exist together in more or less equal amounts, or when the disproportion is not large, a relatively stable condition exists, the theta tending to remain theta and the n-theta tending to remain n-theta. An example of this in the group is the phenomenon of mass hysteria, where one or two members of the group become enturbulated, and very rapidly the remainder of the group becomes enturbulated. This is the basic law of the contagion of aberration. N-theta will enturbulate theta. Misemotion will change emotion into misemotion. Poor communication will change good communication into poor communication. Poor reality will change good reality into poor reality. Poor affinity will change good affinity into poor affinity. The engrams in a case enturbulate theta into the n-theta of secondaries and locks. Among people, one sees this exemplified when a person who is relatively insane enters a group which is relatively sane. The relatively sane may attempt to raise the sanity level of the relatively insane person, and it may occur in this group that the relatively insane person becomes more sane. At the same time, however, the relatively sane people become less sane, unless they have some means or technology for preventing this phenomenon from occurring. In the case of a husband and wife, it is easy to observe that the mate who is higher on the scale will, during the marriage association, drop lower, and usually the mate who is lower on the tone scale will come slightly higher as a result of that association. As a further example, the mate who is lower on the tone scale will demand more affection and give less than the mate who is higher. The mate who is lower will demand more communication and give less, and will assert more reality but will actually have less. It can thus be seen, as represented in column AQ on the chart, that the auditor must have a higher ratio of theta to his n theta than has the pre-clear. A condition must exist where much more theta is available than n theta. An auditor whose theta-n theta ratio is around 2.5 could, with skill, handle individuals lower on the tone scale by not more than 1 point. A 2.5 auditor attempting to handle an apathy case would find his already badly inturbulated condition worsened so much by the case that the case, having very little free theta, would not get much better. A 2.5 auditor attempting to create a clear begins to work uphill as soon as his pre-clear reaches 2.5, and the hill very rapidly becomes too steep to climb. The ideal auditor is one who has a very high endowment of theta and who is at 4.0 on the tone scale. Thus, at the beginning of Dianetics, where we have the usual auditor operating between 2.5 and 3.0, we find it very simple to pull pre-clears up to 2.0 or 2.5, more difficult to bring them up to 3.0. Where auditors are being heavily employed in processing people, they tend to neglect their own processing, and being constantly in the vicinity of and handling n theta, they begin to encounter difficulties with the pre-clear as soon as the pre-clear reaches 2.5. It is incumbent upon the auditor to keep himself continually processed and keep his own tone coming up the scale. Where a co-auditing team exists, one person auditing the other, it is considerably more than a fair exchange for each to give due attention to the state of the other's case. For the moment one begins to appropriate the bulk of processing, his own case will slow down in its progress. Dianetic processing, then, by the theta-mest theory, attempts only one thing: the recovery and conversion of n theta into theta. Any processing which does not accomplish this in an orderly fashion is therefore not valid Dianetic processing. Theta is many things. For a description of it as it applies to the mest organism, you need only read the 4.0 band of the tone scale chart. Theta is reason, serenity, stability, happiness, cheerful emotion, persistence, and the other factors which man ordinarily considers desirable. Any practice which inturbulates theta suppresses the case. The auditor's code is actually a list of the things one must or must not do to preserve the theta-ness of theta and to inhibit the inturbulation of theta by the auditor. Where the pre-clear has a small amount of theta and a large amount of n theta, the auditor must be particularly careful not to inturbulate the existing theta, since it is in the proximity of so much n theta that it inturbulates rapidly. The auditor mishandling such a case, using brute force, invalidations, hypnotism, sadism, or devil worship, can send the free theta still in existence down the track and lock it up in an old secondary or engram, and so find himself with a temporarily completely inturbulated pre-clear on his hands. To avoid this danger, one should mark the pre-clear well on the chart and be guided accordingly. This gives him an estimate of the amount of free theta he has with which to uninturbulate the existing n theta in the case. It may happen that so little theta exists in the case that the auditor must use the lightest and most pleasant methods of which he is capable in order to make enough theta available even to start down the time track. The percentile column, the scale from 0 to 1,000, is an index of the amount of organism theta available to work the case. At 4.0, 100% is available. At 2.0, the amount of theta and permanent n theta are more or less equally balanced, but environmental inturbulation leaves the pre-clear with very little theta. Below this point is the death zone, and here, as the tone lowers, increasingly more danger exists that all the remaining theta will suddenly at one fell swoop become n theta, thus changing the occasional psychotic into a chronic psychotic, at least until rest, good food, and exercise permit the not seriously inturbulated portions of the n theta to become theta again. It takes very poor auditing to accomplish this, and the danger is hardly a danger at all if one follows the chart. The least forceful processing produces the best results. As Dianetic processing evolves, it becomes less and less directive, the pre-clear being allowed more and more latitude in his actions. This should not go so far as to permit the pre-clear to free associate or ramble on endlessly and uselessly. But it does go as far as never driving a pre-clear hard when he balks, unless he is in the middle of a secondary grief or terror engram and is refusing to go on through with it, where if the auditor permits him to leave it, the possibility exists that much skilled auditing will elapse before the auditor will have his pre-clear back into the secondary. The auditor might liken his job to removing the rocks and shoals from the hidden depths of a turbulent river and making of it a smooth-flowing and powerful stream. The auditor is not changing the pre-clear's personality or attempting to improve the pre-clear by evaluations and suggestions. He is simply making it easier for the mind to do what basic personality naturally wants the mind to do. This might be said to be the total end and goal of processing. Chapter 2. The Auditor's Code. The first thing any auditor should know, and know well, about processing is the auditor's code. This has been called the code of how to be civilized. It is much more important than knowing mechanical techniques to know well the attitude one should have toward a pre-clear. This is not for courtesy, but for efficiency. No pre-clear will respond to an auditor who does not adhere to the auditor's code. It must be remembered that the mission of the auditor is not to reduce engrams, not to run out secondaries, not to eradicate psychosomatic illnesses, psychoses, or neuroses, but to raise the pre-clear on the tone scale. It happens that these incidentals of removing neuroses, psychoses, and psychosomatic illnesses, as well as increasing the persistence and general responsibility of the individual, follow in due course so long as the auditor tends closely to his primary mission of raising his pre-clear on the tone scale. If he does not give this his first attention, he is not freeing theta and converting n-theta. And if he does not do this, he cannot efficiently accomplish the other goals. The index of how well he progresses with the pre-clear's case is the tone scale. Mechanical, lackadaisical, and careless auditing can actually remove psychosomatic illnesses and yet not raise the pre-clear on the tone scale. This may be paradoxical, but what happens is that the n-theta in the engram causing the psychosomatic illness is converted into another type of n-theta which is not physically painful to the pre-clear. It is nevertheless n-theta, and the pre-clear is not raised on the tone scale. Thus, the auditor must closely attend to every means which will raise the pre-clear on the tone scale, and should disregard the immediate and short-term goals of the eradication of specific illnesses, bad habits, neuroses, psychoses, obsessions, and compulsions. The auditor must remember that even such a degraded practice as hypnotism can, by the implantation of positive suggestions, suppress certain physical and mental disorders. Though these are suppressed in one quarter, they may very well manifest themselves as something entirely different. A person is saner to have psychosomatic illnesses than he is to have mental aberrations. Hypnotism can, in a small percentage of cases, eradicate the psychosomatic illness, but will produce in its stead a lowered tone in the individual. Electric shock and psychosurgery may alter the behavior pattern of the individual and may suppress him into some tractable condition, but the result is inevitably harmful to the ability, efficiency, and general worth of the subject, with the added detraction that they cause damage to the brain from which the individual never completely recovers. Simply by addressing processing from the viewpoint that one is changing n-theta to theta and freeing up all available theta in the case, one will make the most rapid progress with the pre-clear. Experience in the field has demonstrated that irascible authoritarian auditing can continue for as long as 500 hours, that actual psychosomatic illnesses can be removed, and that some small improvement can be seen in the general tone of the pre-clear. And yet, that neglect of emphasis on raising tone might permit such a case to continue on another 1,000 hours without producing a clear, the n-theta being transferred from one part of the bank to another endlessly. The auditor should give attention to the environment of his pre-clear. Here he may find that his pre-clear is in the vicinity of such restimulative people, situations, and objects that the free theta in the case is continually in a turbulent condition. In such a case, the auditor has every right to recommend a change of environment for the duration of processing. In this alone, he has gained free theta for his pre-clear, and much of the turbulence he observes in his pre-clear will settle out. Cases have been observed in which the pre-clear was in the vicinity of a marital mate who produced such constant tension, so many invalidations, and who had so little thought for or belief in any possible gain for the other, that the processing was only of small benefit, and the auditor was wasting 10 hours of auditing time for every one which was effective. The auditor should not draw back from educating his pre-clear so long as the education is not on a command basis, but is done as an invitation to the self-determinism of the pre-clear to manifest itself, an invitation to the pre-clear to reason things out on a basis of his own adjudication. This is particularly beneficial with children. Indeed, children are surrounded by such ordering about and restrictions that their self-determinism is often too slight to cope with anything like their personal situations. In such a case, it is definitely the role of the auditor to invite the child to think things out for himself, occasionally redefining words or situations for the child. Actually, an auditor can take 2 or 3 pre-clears and form an educational group, wherein mutual discussion of their own problems will result in a rise of tone in the pre-clears. The third method of processing, of course the most lasting method, is auditing by Dianetic processing, wherein the auditor concentrates on freeing all available theta in the case and converting as much n theta as possible to theta. The auditor's first step toward accomplishing this, should he consider the environmental situation compatible, is to promote affinity, communication, and reality with his pre-clear, and to found a group of 2, himself and his pre-clear. The auditor must recognize that he is dealing with a person, in every case, whose conduct is not as good as it will be. Thus the auditor must practice much self-restraint and must form an example for his pre-clear. To do this, the auditor must never, under any circumstances or for any reason, break any part of the auditor's code with the pre-clear. Breaking the auditor's code, at first glance, may not appear to be a very great sin, but an auditor has undertaken to aid a fellow man, and his dedication to that purpose must be sincere to the point of sacredness. An auditor, by misusing his position through what he knows about the human mind, can bring havoc upon an unsuspecting pre-clear. Carelessness alone, if it is backed with good intention, can seldom do much harm. But malicious intent, wherein an auditor expects to gain heavily by use of deception and misuse of the sacred trust he has taken unto himself in helping his fellow man, can cast a pre-clear far back down the tone scale. If one does not feel that he can keep the auditor's code wholly and completely, he should not under any circumstances audit anyone. Nor should he permit himself to be persuaded to audit anyone. And any pre-clear should be very wary of permitting himself to be audited by anyone who potentially would break the auditor's code. The pre-clear who finds himself confronted with an auditor's code break should instantly and finally terminate his processing with that auditor, and should find another who can keep the code. A man who will break this code once will break it many times. And the pre-clear should never persist in the arrangement out of the argument that he can get only one auditor. Anyone who breaks this code is under 2.5 on the chart and should not be auditing, but should be in the process of being audited himself. An open-hearted and sincere effort to practice Dianetics, after a thorough study of the principles contained in this book, should the student adhere to these principles, will produce marked and beneficial effects upon human beings never before attained in man's history. To produce these effects, the auditor must permit himself to be embraced by the auditor's code, and to keep these principles as sacred as if they were the vows of priesthood. The auditor conducts himself in such a way as to maintain optimum affinity, communication, and agreement with the pre-clear. The auditor is trustworthy. He understands that the pre-clear has given into the auditor's trust his hope for higher sanity and happiness, and that the trust is sacred and never to be betrayed. The auditor is courteous. He respects the pre-clear as a human being. He respects the self-determinism of the pre-clear. He respects his own position as an auditor. He expresses this respect in courteous conduct. The auditor is courageous. He never falls back from his duty to a case. He never fails to use optimum procedure, regardless of any alarming conduct on the part of the pre-clear. The auditor never evaluates the case for the pre-clear. He abstains from this, knowing that to compute for the pre-clear is to inhibit the pre-clear's own computation. He knows that to refresh the pre-clear's mind as to what went before is to cause the pre-clear to depend heavily upon the auditor and so to undermine the self-determinism of the pre-clear. The auditor never invalidates any of the data or the personality of the pre-clear. He knows that in doing so he would seriously enturbulate the pre-clear. He refrains from criticism and invalidation, no matter how much the auditor's own sense of reality is twisted or shaken by the pre-clear's incidents or utterances. The auditor uses only techniques designed to restore the self-determinism of the pre-clear. He refrains from all authoritarian or dominating conduct, leading always rather than driving. He refrains from the use of hypnotism or sedatives on the pre-clear, no matter how much the pre-clear may demand them out of aberration. He never abandons the pre-clear out of faint-heartedness about the ability of techniques to resolve the case, but persists and continues to restore the pre-clear's self-determinism. The auditor keeps himself informed of any new skills in the science. The auditor cares for himself as an auditor. By working with others, he maintains his own processing at regular intervals in order to maintain or raise his own position on the tone scale, despite restimulation of himself through the process of auditing others. He knows that failure to give heed to his own processing until he himself is a release or a clear in the severest meaning of the terms is to cost his pre-clear the benefit of the auditor's best performance. This is the auditor's code. It has been discovered that the two most important aspects of the code are the preservation of the pre-clear's sense of reality and the trustworthiness of the auditor. An invalidation of the pre-clear's data, no matter how outrageously that data may assault the auditor's own sense of reality, can be severe and will go so far as to shut off the pre-clear's sonic and visio all in a moment. Most pre-clears are uncertain enough in the presence of their own past. They quite commonly invalidate themselves, a practice from which they should be discouraged. When the auditor invalidates the pre-clear's data, the shock to the pre-clear can be very great. In the matter of trustworthiness, the auditor must never take advantage of the pre-clear, either in using his data or in using a temporary state of apathy, propitiation, or restimulation in order to possess himself carnally of the pre-clear or to gain materially. Any two people in constant association who will conduct themselves according to the auditor's code will soon find not only that they are clear or almost clear as a group of two, but also that their knowledge of and joy in human relationships has been immeasurably increased. Chapter 3. The Mechanics of Aberration. According to the basic theory of Dianetics, theta, by which is meant the life force, life energy, divine energy, elan vital, or by any other name, the energy peculiar to life which acts upon material in the physical universe and animates it, mobilizes it, and changes it, is susceptible to alteration in character or vibration, at which time it becomes enturbulated theta, or n-theta. A description of pure theta, acting in a harmonious control of MEST, is to be found along the 4.0 band of the chart. Here we see theta as reasonable, persistent, responsible, with an affinity very high in all spheres of attraction, capable of high communication both perceptically and with ideas, and with a high sense and appreciation of reality. An individual whose theta is uninturbulated in his current environment, whose education is not inturbulated by poor data and bad teachers in an unreasonable culture, and from whose life has been deleted all the physical and mental pain given an average genetic background, would be a very high order of clear. The things which reduce the individual down from the state of clear and bring him lower on the tone scale would be a turbulent and unhappy environment, a poor and unreasonable education in a not too rational culture, poor physical endowment, and, what is most important to the auditor, theta trapped as n-theta in past moments of physical pain, and further theta trapped as charge as later consequences of that physical pain. So far as the immediate address to the case is concerned, the auditor might conceive of a case as being potentially relatively pure theta, as modified by environment, education, and physical endowment, but that this theta has in past moments of pain and sorrow become, at least some portion of it, converted to n theta, which is held at various moments of a person's past. By methods of processing, the auditor frees the n theta, which automatically converts to theta and becomes available to the individual's general action in life, and so raises him automatically on the tone scale. Physical pain could be said to be the alarm reaction to theta that the organism has been too heavily impinged upon MEST. Physical pain is an abrupt and sharp warning of non-survival. Without a mechanism of physical pain, no organism could be warned of physical dangers through experiencing pain. And so, no organism could survive, since no organism would have a perception of destruction. Thus, physical pain is actually a perceptic, just as sight and sound are perceptics. Physical pain as a perception mechanism lies immediately behind every other perception mechanism, since too much light can cause pain, too much sound can cause pain, too much motion can cause pain, and so forth. MEST, which is to say the physical universe of matter, energy, space, and time, is perceived by the theta of the organism by the various perceptions of sight, sound, motion, organic sensation, and so forth. The moment any of these grows too intense, theta's orderly and harmonious control of MEST undergoes a shock of interruption. The theta and MEST brought too closely together in turbulence thus form n theta and n MEST. Every individual has a time track. This is simply all of the perceptions of a lifetime, from conception to present time, the organism time track. Every moment of now, present time, finds the organism registering by perception some portion of the physical universe. These perceptions are stored in what is called the standard memory bank, if they are analytical and not physically painful, or in the reactive memory bank if they contain physical pain. Thus, these perceptions are stored in an unending continuation from the first moment of cellular life forward to present time. The time track is a consecutive series of nows through day and night, week, month, and year for all the lifetime. Each time the perceptions, by reason of severe turbulence, record as physical pain, the theta present could be said to be converted and held there static by n-MEST. Every physically painful recording is missing from the time track, so far as standard memory is concerned, and is filed instead in the reactive bank. Each time this occurs, less theta is apparently available to the analyzing and conscious portion of the person's being, and becomes a debit on the n theta side of the ledger. So long as the individual possesses proportionately more theta than n theta, he is fairly well up the tone scale. But when the trapped n theta begins to outweigh the theta, the individual is brought down the tone scale to a non-survival level. The position of the person on the tone scale determines not only his potential for happiness, but also his longevity. Immortality can be measured in many ways. The higher a person is on the tone scale, the more he tends toward immortality. The lower a person is on the tone scale, the more he tends toward death. The amount of theta in the case determines the amount of survival potential of the individual, and the amount of n theta in the case determines the amount of non-survival potential. The auditor, by processing, frees the n theta from the case, thus increasing the survival potential of the individual. The processes which free n theta and convert it into theta may be formidable in theory, but in practice are quite simple and may be done by rote, since it is the nature of theta readily to convert back to its free and uninturbulated state when given simple assistance. It should be thoroughly understood by the auditor that, according to theory, confirmed by observation in practice, no n theta exists unless it has, as its basic cause, physical pain. It should be no less well understood that n theta, when it contacts small quantities of theta, makes that into n theta as well. Further, theta contacting smaller quantities of n theta converts the n theta into theta. This is a two-way conversion. Theta in proximity to n theta makes theta out of it. N theta in proximity to theta makes n theta out of it. From this we have the contagion of aberration, a principle of considerable importance in Dianetics. Theta in the vicinity of n theta becomes enturbulated and made into n theta. It was once thought that insanity was inherited. It is true that a genetic endowment in terms of structure, or an endowment of too small a quantity of theta, may predispose one person more than others to insanity, but only in the vicinity of n-theta. Of course, there can be the insanity of malformed brains, where some of the perception and computation mechanisms are absent. But this type of insanity results only in inability to think, not in aberrated thinking. It is not true, then, that insanity is hereditary. Insanity apparently comes about wholly by contagion. An inturbulated culture or environment can keep an individual in a continuous state of turbulence. But, lacking engrams, that individual would cease to be inturbulated as soon as he removed himself from the source of the turbulence. People who are insane bring those around them markedly down on the tone scale, and could be said to be responsible for all the existing insanity in the race. If one associates with badly aberrated individuals, one will himself, in consequence, become badly aberrated, if only while in the vicinity of the badly aberrated associates. There is an apparent family line of aberration. It was previously thought to be carried genetically, but this is evidently not the case. It is carried on the thought channel of the family. The confusions of domestic life get into the moments of physical injury of the child, and the child as a consequence becomes liable for the family aberrations and will manifest them. The principle of the contagion of aberration is broad in scope. One can observe in any group of men that one or two may be much more aberrated than the others. One can make the simple experiment of removing the one or two aberrated persons from the group, and he will then see that the general tone level of the group will rise, since the source of the group's main turbulence has been removed. By examining the life of any pre-clear, his case history, and without examining any of the pre-clear's own aberrations, the auditor can make a good estimate of the pre-clear's aberrations simply by discovering what manner of people the parents were. It is an inexorable fact that these aberrations, one way or another, will manifest themselves in the pre-clear. The auditor should fully understand the principle of contagion. Fortunately, the conversion works in both directions. Sanity is also contagious. Thus, by observing the auditor's code and providing a sane environment for his pre-clear, the auditor can bring some of the n-theta in the pre-clear's case back into the state of theta without any processing. This is particularly valuable in the treatment of psychotics. There could be said to be 3 divisions of n-theta. Basically, the only way n-theta comes into being in any life form is through physical injury. But after the physical injury is present, the n-theta in it contagions into the theta involved in circumstances that approach or approximate those of the physical injury. When this happens, we have another kind of n-theta, locks formed by restimulation. The shocks of conscious moments, the griefs and sorrows, the fears and angers, the breaks of affinity, communication, and reality which one has with life would be the third kind of n-theta, which would be temporary n-theta, if it were not for the presence of physical injury and its n-theta in the case. To make this plainer, first there is the engram. This is physical pain, n-mest and n-theta, held at a specific point on the time track. This might never become serious, but for restimulation by the environment. When this engram becomes restimulated, it makes much of the existing free theta in the organism turbulent. Some of this turbulence remains as additional frozen n-theta. Some of it uninturbulates and becomes theta again. The engram, a moment of physical pain, forms the basis for n-theta, and having formed it, little by contagion, steals free theta from the individual and makes it into n-theta permanently in the form of secondary engrams and locks. At the moment of restimulation, perhaps nearly all of the individual's theta becomes inturbulated, but this more or less rapidly uninturbulates or settles out and becomes theta again. One could then have a picture of a time track as a straight line from conception to present time. At some early point on this time track, there is a moment of physical injury. At a little bit later on the track, this moment is approximated by the environment. This would be a key-in. Actually, the individual has to be more or less inturbulated by the general environment when the key-in takes place, which is to say, he would have to be worried or tired or perhaps only annoyed about something. This key-in now gives the engram more power and strength. The next time the engram is restimulated, another lock is added and would be marked as a third point on the track. Then let us say that some loss takes place which approximates in some way or ways this original engram. If it were such a thing as the death of a loved one, an enormous amount of turbulence would take place. The turbulence, by its very magnitude, approximates the nature of physical pain. A very large amount of theta becomes trapped by the physical pain. This would be called a secondary engram. The difference between a secondary engram and a lock is the order of magnitude of the trapped theta, that is, n theta. Each time a secondary occurs, the whole of the theta of the individual may be temporarily enturbulated. But only a small portion remains frozen as n theta, and the remaining enturbulated theta converts back into free theta. Thus, one can see that as life progresses, more and more theta becomes fixed as n theta in locks and secondary engrams, and less theta is available to the organism for purposes of reason. This is called the dwindling spiral. It is so called because the more n theta there is on the case, the more theta will be turned into n theta at each new restimulation. It is a three-dimensional vicious circle which carries the individual down the tone scale. In a child, very few locks and secondaries have been formed, and so the child's theta is free and the child's tone is high. Yet even though this child receives no more engrams for several years, the engrams he already has may gradually be charged up by locks and secondaries until he has less free theta than n theta, at which time he would be very low on the tone scale. It may also happen that some enormous success in life, an extremely happy marriage or association with high theta individuals, will work on the reactive bank to convert it without processing, at least in part, back into free theta. Here is the calmness of the aberrated person who quits the turbulent world, for instance, and takes the vows of the Church. In this new environment, he has fewer approximations of his old locks and engrams. But more importantly, he is in the vicinity of far more theta, and he will, as a consequence, disinturbulate and therefore rise on the tone scale. Similarly, that person who is idle without goal or direction may find his accumulation of secondaries and locks is far greater, since his theta, being idle, is already slightly enturbulated. This individual may become very busy in the pursuit of some definite and worthwhile goal, and his theta, thus unenturbulated, will rob his locks and secondaries of some of the n theta they contain. An individual who in one environment may have been living under extremely unhealthy conditions may change his mode of existence so as to include exercise, sunshine, and fresh air. And this change, bringing about a better physical condition, will itself unenturbulate the individual to some degree. Dianetic processing does simply this. It uses the theta of the preclear as aided by the theta of the auditor to disinturbulate the theta contained in the preclear's locks, secondaries, and engrams. The goal of the auditor is to disinturbulate n theta, not necessarily to run engrams or to concentrate on locks or secondaries, one more than another. In various cases, various conditions exist which make it necessary to address first one and then another of these three types of n theta. The auditor should thoroughly understand the anatomy of the engram as well as that of the secondary and of the lock. An engram comes about when the individual organism suffers an intense impact with MEST. This is actual physical pain. It may occur in any portion of the body, and may be from simply too intense a reception of light or sound, erosion as in chafing or sunburn, cuts, contusions, fractures, organic derangements, overdoses of poisonous substances, attacks by bacteria and viruses, or any usual or unusual cause of physical pain. Every moment of physical pain contains with it a partial or major shutdown of the analytical function of the mind. Consciousness may be interrupted for a moment or for days by physical pain, but regardless of the duration, physical pain always brings about lowered consciousness. One may not realize this completely until one has had erased from him an instant in which he burned his finger or something equally inconsequential. He will learn that while he had supposed he knew everything that happened during that moment of pain, some data yet remained hidden concerning the incident. This missing data is the content of the reactive mind. The engram contains all of the perceptions present during the period of its receipt. Before Dianetics, this was not realized. It was thought that an unconscious person was simply unconscious, and the things which were said to him and that other perceptible entities which impinged upon him went unrecorded. No matter the depth of unconsciousness in the presence of physical pain, the reactive mind records fully and completely all the perceptions possible in the environment, including the physical pain. During an operation involving anesthesia, for instance, all the physical pain, the doctor's words, the smell of the ether, the nurse's footsteps, the feel of the table and the functions of the internal organs, among other things, are recorded in full in the reactive mind of the individual as an engram. If one is acquainted with hypnotism, one can readily understand the compulsive or obsessive character of data, which is out of sight of the conscious mind, but which is yet forced upon it from below by the drive of physical pain. Hidden data and hidden pain cause identity thinking, so that the power to differentiate and thus to reason is reduced. An individual obeys engrams literally. When an engram is restimulated, the individual may dramatize the engram, or go through the cycle of action demanded by the engram if it can be dramatized. Dramatized or not, the engram containing unconsciousness reduces the analytical awareness of the individual, and a person who has many engrams in restimulation is ordinarily less than 1/4 analytically aware and can still be considered normal. The n-theta of the engram makes it possible for locks to form. The engram is restimulated in the individual when he is less analytically alert than ordinarily by reason of weariness or other non-optimum conditions. The engram may contain certain perceptics which are duplicated in the immediate environ of the individual. This approximation of the environ to the engram brings about an identification of the exterior world with the interior world of engrams, and so brings about restimulation of the engram. This restimulation manifests itself in the inturbulation of the individual. The process of inturbulation fixes into the engram some of the individual's theta permanently, converting it to n-theta. The first time an engram is restimulated, and one may lie dormant for 40 years without being restimulated, is called a key-in. A key-in is merely a special kind of lock. The secondary engram takes place when the turbulence of the individual is very high. Anger, fear, grief, or apathy may be occasioned by the environment, and if a physical pain engram underlies this situation and even vaguely approximates it in perceptics, enormous quantities of theta are trapped as n-theta in the secondary. The secondary engram is enormously important. It is run exactly like a physical pain engram. If one could remove all the secondary engrams from a case without touching physical pain engrams, he would have a release. The secondary stores such large quantities of n-theta that remarkable results are often obtained by running one simple secondary engram. The auditor should understand thoroughly, however, that no secondary engram can exist unless a physical pain engram underlies it. In running a secondary engram, the auditor may often discover that, with it, he is running also a physical pain engram. Affinity, communication, and reality enforcements and breaks in a case are not specialized types of secondaries or locks, but are only the component parts of secondaries and locks. Any physical pain engram is a break of affinity between theta and MEST, and is indeed the basic affinity break. The break of affinity brings about reduction of communication, since the theta no longer wishes to approach this type of MEST as avidly as before. And as the theta is not in harmonious agreement with MEST, the reality is reduced. Here we have, in affinity, communication, and reality breaks, the basic cause of trouble in any organism. The intent of theta is harmoniously to conquer MEST, and when MEST reacts suddenly and without warning against the theta organism, the basic impulse of that theta is thwarted. Thus, this could be said to be the basis of all aberration, and by observation and experience this postulate seems to be adequately confirmed. The engram becomes charged up with n-theta through the process of the individual's acquiring locks and secondaries. An engram which is too highly charged not only cannot be run, but ordinarily cannot even be contacted until secondaries and locks are reduced. Thus, in most cases, the first address of the auditor is to locks and then secondaries and then engrams, with the treatment of more locks and secondaries to make available more engrams. The whole purpose of the auditor is to change n theta to theta as rapidly and as efficiently as possible. Where he gets the n theta, whether out of engrams, secondaries, or locks, is of no basic concern. Theta is theta. Chapter 4. The Dynamics of Existence. Behind Dianetics, there is considerable technology concerning knowledge itself and general philosophies about thinking, without which Dianetics could not have come into existence. The major postulate of Dianetics is, the dynamic principle of existence is survive. Theta, where its purpose is the conquest of mest, life and organisms have no other principle than survive as their motivation. The opposite to this motivation is succumb. Two basic axioms about knowledge are as follows. Axiom 1. A datum is as important as it is evaluated in terms of survive or succumb. Axiom 2. A datum can only be evaluated by data of comparable magnitude. The basic unit of both the theta and the mest universes is 2, not 1. The basic unit of 1 as a postulate is impossible, since it has nothing by which it can be evaluated. Therefore, the basic unit of 2 is necessary. Attempting to postulate anything on the basis of 1 as the basic unit brings about considerable disorder in thought. The Supreme Being, for instance, has as the second datum for evaluation the devil. The Supreme Being is survive. The devil is succumb. The basic postulate of Dianetics contains, as an understood portion, the fact that survive is matched by succumb. The failure to survive is to succumb. Theta, as an energy, insofar as we observe it in organisms which are partially mest, survives or succumbs. Mest, in accordance with the most fundamental physical laws and the conservation of energy, survives or succumbs. It will be noted in both cases that succumbing is apparently the conversion of the energy into another form. Theta converting into n theta travels from survive to succumb. But the energy is not lost, and death is one of the freeing mechanisms by which the theta is able to become momentarily independent of mest, and so combine again with mest, forming another organism to carry along the generations. In the physical universe, energy survives, but the forms the energy takes often succumb and change into other energy forms. The chart of the tone scale divides at 2.0. Above this point, the direction of dynamic action of the organism is toward survival. The organism will seek higher levels of survival, will try to live as long as possible and as well as possible, both of which are components of survival, since, in general, the more bountiful the existence, the better the potentials of survival. Below 2.0, the dynamic action of the organism tends toward succumb. The individual may apparently engage upon survival activities, but will do something to bring about a non-survival end, regardless of what activity the individual engages upon. Below 2.0, the individual will tend toward the death of himself, sex, the future, groups, or mankind. He is destructive toward life. He makes n-mest out of any mest he may have at hand or can influence. He repels theta and attracts n-theta. This is the band of the immoral, the promiscuous, the criminal, the fascist, the godless, the suicide, and other undesirables. Whatever action is taken by the individual who is acutely or chronically below 2.0 will tend toward the death of himself or anything with which he is associated. His avowals may be entirely different, and he may even himself believe that he seeks higher survival levels. But the end product of his actions, whether these actions apply to a business, to a marriage, to a friendship, to a group, or to a religion, will be death or some undesirable non-survival situation, which of course itself tends toward death. It is not realized generally that the criminal is not only antisocial, but is also anti-self. Anyone below 2.0 is a potential or active criminal in that crimes against the pro-survival actions of others are continually perpetrated. Crime might be defined as the reduction of the survival level along any one of the 8 dynamics. Police are continually baffled by the irrationality of the criminal. Since police officers are ordinarily rational men and tend themselves toward survival, they sometimes cannot readily comprehend that the criminal habitually takes the route of non-survival for himself and his group. No matter the criminal's IQ, he will leave obvious clues on the scene. He will flee from crimes at a rate of speed calculated to attract the attention of any traffic officer. Trapped in a criminal act which has as its penalty as little as 30 days in jail, the criminal may attempt to use weapons against police, and thus commit suicide at the expense of some worthy officer's life. The most baffling thing in police work is an attempt to deduce motives using any kind of a rational yardstick upon the criminal. The only motive the criminal has is destruction along any one of the dynamics, including the first. It sometimes happens that if a criminal is promised non-survival in return for information, he will gladly make the trade, whereas he refuses to give information in return for liberty and continued good health. Those who aid criminals or deal with them know, to their sorrow, that the criminal ordinarily repays a helping hand with destructive actions. Parole boards are rendered particularly dismayed by the number of times their extension of liberty, on certain conditions, is repaid by destructive action. Police have for some time looked for a proper definition for a true criminal. Men should be removed from society only when they constitute a continual or occasional threat to that society. An answer to this problem may be found in the accompanying chart. The old adages about the forces of good and the forces of evil are amazingly apt when one studies men from the standpoint of the Theta Mess theory. In order to understand this further, perhaps one should offer the Dianetic axioms for good and for evil. Good can be considered to be any constructive survival action. It happens that no construction can take place without some small destruction, just as the tenement must be torn down to make room for the new apartment building. Good is further modified by the viewpoint of the individual. To be good, something must contribute to the individual, to his family, his children, his group, mankind, or life. To be good, a thing must contain construction which outweighs the destruction it contains. A new cure which saves 100 and kills 1 is an acceptable cure. What is good from the viewpoint of one person may be bad for another person. In the case of A, who gets a new job, this is good for A, but perhaps bad for B, who was released so that A could have the job. Good is survival. Good is being right more than one is wrong. Good is being more successful than one is unsuccessful along constructive lines. Things are good which complement the survival of the individual, his family, children, group, mankind, life, and mest. Acts are good which are more beneficial than destructive along these dynamics, as modified by the viewpoint of the individual, the future race, the group, mankind, life, or mest. Evil is the opposite of good and is anything which is destructive more than it is constructive along any of the various dynamics. A thing which does more destruction than construction is evil from the viewpoint of the individual, the future, group, species, life, or mest that it destroys. When an act is more destructive than constructive, it is evil. When an act assists succumb more than it assists survival, it is an evil act in the proportion that it destroys. A thing is evil which threatens more destruction than construction for the individual, future, group, mankind, life, or mest. Good, bluntly, is survival. Evil is non-survival. Construction is good when it promotes survival. Destruction is bad when it inhibits survival. Construction is evil when it inhibits survival. Destruction is good when it enhances survival. An act or conclusion is as right as it promotes the survival of the individual, future, group, mankind, or life making the conclusion. To be entirely right would be to survive to infinity. An act or conclusion is wrong to the degree that it is non-survival to the individual, future race, group, species, or life responsible for doing the act or making the conclusion. The most wrong a person can be is dead. The individual or group, which is, on the average, righter than wrong, since these terms are not absolutes by far, should survive. An individual who is wronger than right, on the average, will succumb. All conclusions are modified by time, since one conclusion made wrong during an emergency can cause the non-survival of the individual or the group. Individuals above 2.0 on the tone scale are more and more right in their actions and conclusions than they are wrong as they rise up the tone scale. Individuals below 2.0 are, on the average, increasingly more wrong than they are right in all fields as they descend the tone scale. Accepting these postulates and axioms, it can then be observed that one can predict to some degree what he may expect from individuals above or below 2.0 on the tone scale. A reasonable individual attempts to read into the acts of others some reason. An individual who is tending toward survival tends to evaluate the conduct of others in terms of efforts to survive. He may see in an individual below 2.0 what he thinks is merely an aberrated inaccuracy or an occasional mistake. But closer observation will demonstrate that the individual below 2.0 is aggregating numerous mistakes, even while being occasionally right, and is tending to bring about the non-survival of himself, of the future, of the group, and by contagion, the mankind of which he would like to be a part. Below 2.0 lies fatality. That fatality may be manifested on a gradient scale. It may only be nagging or forgetfulness or occasional gossip, but it is destructive and it is evil. In an older time, a stern voice could have said that those who lie below 2.0 are the servants of evil and the minions of the devil. These few axioms should give the auditor some ability to predict actions and to know the reasons he should expect certain actions on the part of pre-clears. Very little experimental evidence exists with regard to many aspects of the theta body, or as it might otherwise be called, the individual soul. It is distinct from cellular or genetic line, and apparently has its own personality and follows in a continuing line along the various generations, possibly now and then advancing to a point where it separates itself from the race and joins the theta universe, if this can be considered to exist as such. The data accumulated would also seem to indicate that some n-theta is carried forward along the line of the generations, since engrams in the theta body exist, if to a much lighter extent, specifically the death engram, where the theta body is very much in evidence, so much so that if the auditor neglects to run the death engram of a past life when it is presented by the pre-clear, he will, without fail, bog down his case. There seems to be a distinct possibility that the theta body might begin, through the generations, to carry a preponderance of n-theta by being too continually in the lower area of the tone scale. It could be postulated that the theta body might become an n-theta body entirely, and so drop out of the survival concatenations. To what destination, one cannot surely say. Chapter 5. General Description of Processing. Dianetic processing is relatively simple. The auditor usually assists the pre-clear, provided with an easy chair and a couch. The pre-clear at first normally sits up and answers the questions of the inventory. This actually is the beginning of processing, although it may appear that the auditor is merely seeking information which he can later use. During the inventory, the interest of the auditor in the pre-clear builds up affinity between them. The discussion of the case increases communication, and the auditor's acceptance of the pre-clear's first evaluations of his own case builds up a sense of reality. The auditor can tear down these desirable ARC conditions by being bored, uninterested in his pre-clear, peremptory, demanding that less time be consumed, criticizing the pre-clear in any way, or, in general, breaking the auditor's code. The auditor then makes a test of the case, finding out whether or not the pre-clear can move on the track, finding out whether the pre-clear's memory is good, and estimating what level of the tone scale his pre-clear probably occupies. Caution: the auditor under no circumstances should tell the pre-clear where he thinks the pre-clear lies on the chart. He should not be inveigled in any way into disclosing where he thinks the pre-clear lies on the chart, since a low value on the chart for the pre-clear is, in effect, an invalidation of the pre-clear himself. The auditor does not have to disclose this information even by the way he starts in his processing, for any case can be expected to be given lock scanning and straight wire. A case may be actually well up the tone scale, but so occluded that lock scanning and straight wire must be employed. The auditor furthers his investigation of the case by asking the pre-clear to lie down on the couch and close his eyes. In the past, there was some confusion about the condition called reverie. The only difference between being in reverie and being awake is actually being in or out of present time. Reverie is not even a cousin to hypnotism. The auditor, contrary to any early practice, does not count the pre-clear into a state of reverie or concentration. The moment he asks the pre-clear to close his eyes and the pre-clear complies, the auditor can consider the pre-clear to be in reverie. If the pre-clear does not move on the track, this is not caused by a failure to be in reverie, but by being stuck in an engram or having a heavily charged case. The auditor tests out the perceptics of the pre-clear by simply asking the pre-clear to go back to a recent meal he has eaten or a recent pleasure moment, and having him recount this moment over several times, not as a concept of the moment, but as if he were right on the scene doing the things again which were done before. This is called testing or tuning the perceptics. The auditor here is attempting to discover whether or not the pre-clear can actually taste again a steak he has eaten, see again the scene he has seen exactly as it was, feel again the knife and fork in his hands, hear again the conversation around him, feel again his weight upon the chair, and, in general, re-experience the incident. Running several such pleasure moments, it occasionally happens that some of the occluded perceptics tune up and turn on. In any event, running pleasure moments is very good for raising the tone of the pre-clear. Having run a perceptic test, the auditor takes the pre-clear, merely by asking him to go to a moment when he was very slightly injured, to a point on the track where he has a somatic. The auditor runs the incident. The somatic, if felt at all, will ordinarily reduce. This should be a recent moment of physical pain and should be a very minor one, such as a cut finger or a stubbed toe. This gives the pre-clear some idea of what he is expected to do. The auditor should pay particular attention to the fact that he is actually educating his pre-clear into track movement. The pre-clear may have to be coaxed several times before he gets the idea of being back in an incident and re-experiencing it. He may try to give merely the concept of the incident, instead of perceiving it as though he were right there going through it again. He might try to free associate, and so wander around all over the track, getting odds and ends and bits of information which are relatively valueless. After estimating the perceptics, the auditor should continue according to the chart on which by this time he should have thoroughly located his pre-clear. Questions of almost unlimited variety will have been asked by the auditor. Simply by using the data in various columns and levels on the chart, he can avoid a stereotyped approach and be sure of turning up the information he needs. The most significant points on the test run are movement on the track and the ability of the pre-clear to feel somatics. The auditor continues processing according to the chart, occasionally checking the pre-clear for any rise on the tone scale, and if he finds a rise in tone, he may use additional methods as delineated on the chart. The auditor should be particularly chary of using on the pre-clear methods above the pre-clear's tone level. It is better to err by using methods below the pre-clear's tone level. Those individuals who are relatively low on the tone scale have so little free theta available for processing that it must be preserved and added to by the gentlest and lightest methods possible for some time until the pre-clear's tone rises. Should the auditor discover that the pre-clear lies high in one column and low in another column, he should take an average and by this discover the approximate position on the tone scale. If the auditor is unable immediately to establish the pre-clear on the tone scale, it is in general safe to use lock scanning without much investigation of the case. Even a case which is stuck on the time track can be lock scanned. If the pre-clear is scanned through his locks and sticks in one of these locks, the auditor can generally free him by running pleasure moments or scanning pleasure moments if he does not want to run the incident in which the pre-clear is hung up. Even when stuck in an engram, pre-clears usually can be lock scanned. The auditor should not be beguiled or sent astray by the wide-open case. This case is a very peculiar thing, as discussed elsewhere. Sonic and Visio can be on full from the top to the bottom of the tone scale, but trying to run engrams on a wide-open case, as engrams, when the case is at 0.5 or 1.1, will bring about a long and arduous course of processing in which the pre-clear will remain more or less static on the tone scale, regardless of how many engrams are run out of the case. When such a case, or any case, is low on the tone scale, the running of engrams absorbs free theta. Further, the pre-clear will consistently combat running engrams, since when any pre-clear is below 2.0, his tendency is toward death, suicide, or further decline. No plans or hopes for the future, no coaxings, nothing will persuade this pre-clear to do anything very arduous to help himself. A pre-clear low on the tone scale may, however, be persuaded into some of the milder methods of processing, since they do not occasion much effort and actually do not seem to threaten his intended decline, since, make no mistake, the pre-clear below 2.0 will, one way or another, by knowing or unknowing intent, bring about failures and consequent death to himself, his associates, and his group. The wide-open case must be established on the tone scale by columns other than visio and sonic. It is best located by its sense of reality, sexual behavior, other manifestations, and the condition of the somatics. The wide-open case, which is low on the tone scale, must be handled with great care, since here we have, unlike the occluded case, a persistence so low that the individual drifts at the command of any engram or changes course at the slightest pressure from the environment. The wide-open case low on the tone scale has no feeling of responsibility toward self, future, or group, save aberrated ones. Persistence is so slight that any auditing errors can cause the case to withdraw from any processing. Here is an individual who climbs molehills as though they were mountains. This case can be the greatest trial to the auditor and will render, unfortunately, the most unsatisfying final results. The wide-open case can, of course, be low on the tone scale only temporarily because of some environmental situation. If so, the auditor had better extend himself, if he can, to clear up this situation before he begins auditing. This case is also a great liability to the auditor when low on the tone scale because of the vagaries of behavior. If a woman, she may offer herself freely to the auditor, disregarding her position in life, her husband, the future she may blast by doing so, the fate of any children she may have, or any other consideration. Woe betide the luckless male auditing such a case who involves himself with this bundle of destruction, since as she would betray another, so she will betray him. As she will be dishonest with another, so she will be dishonest with the auditor. The dishonesty will extend not only to treachery and betrayal, wherein she may freely surrender to the auditor, and then go directly to the police to have him arrested for seduction, and wherein she may promise the greatest secrecy around any liaison, and yet strew all about evidence of that liaison. But she will also be dishonest when being run, and will, for no other reason than to confuse the picture, deliver up the most twisted and perverted scenes of her own life. Raised amid riches, she will represent herself as having been a pauper. Raised a pauper, she will represent herself as a princess. She will normally have pride in her ability to act, and will commonly writhe and moan and weep over some incident that she quite consciously knows to be imaginary. No trust of any kind can be placed in a wide-open case when it is below 2.0 on the tone scale. And for that matter, no trust can be put in an occluded case below 2.0 on the tone scale. But the wide-open case is far more deceptive and far more prone to wide vagaries in behavior and delusion. The male wide-open case is no less difficult in trying, but, strangely enough, seems by observation to be far more persistent, either toward destruction or in efforts toward survival, than the female case. The auditor will have his problems with pre-clears who want attention but not processing. These pre-clears are automatically classifiable as below 2.0. This is the quickest chart location which can be done. The pre-clear who wants no kind of processing whatsoever, even though he understands some of the principles involved and knows they will not be harmful, and the pre-clear who wants no processing but to be hovered over are both headed toward succumb and will do their best to pull the auditor with them. As a shooting and quick burial for such people is frowned upon, at least at this time, the auditor should employ his ingenuity if he will continue processing them. He should use very light methods and a cat-foot approach, and he may be able to raise his pre-clear enough above 2.0 to cause a continuing direction toward survival. It should be borne in mind by the auditor, when he is doing his inventory and when he is locating his pre-clear on the chart, that people below 2.0 may not be immediately obvious. Their acceptance of processing may be only a method of securing attention. However, the auditor, by using light, routine methods, can produce the necessary rise on the tone scale to get the case to resolve itself. The auditor should remember that the contest is between his own theta, his reasonableness, his serenity, and his persistence, and the n theta of the pre-clear, the pre-clear's locks, secondaries, and engrams. The moment the auditor permits his own n theta to attack the pre-clear, turbulence is produced, and a reduction of the pre-clear on the tone scale will ensue. Thus, becoming angry, critical, stupid, avaricious, destructive, or malicious toward the pre-clear reverses processing. The pre-clear is not responsible for his engrams. The auditor is concerned with what has been done to the pre-clear, not what has been done by the pre-clear. The auditor should exhibit no morbid curiosity about the acts of the pre-clear. He should not inquire into the pre-clear's own doings unless he needs to find, in the dramatizations of the pre-clear, a clue to the engrams which caused the dramatizations. Getting angry at the pre-clear because the pre-clear will not run an engram is certain to lower the pre-clear on the tone scale. The auditor, poor fellow, must retain his patience even under upbraidings from the pre-clear. The auditor must never justify himself when the pre-clear thinks he has made a mistake. For the auditor to explain how it was not a mistake is only to further enturbulate the situation. When the pre-clear is returned to some point prior to present time at the auditor's request, the auditor should under no circumstances use more words than are absolutely necessary, and should, at this time in particular, be careful to observe the auditor's code, since the incident may contain anaton and the pre-clear may be receptive to hypnotic suggestions. This is also true of a boil-off. The auditor should not talk to the pre-clear during a boil-off, should not try to wrestle the pre-clear into alertness out of the feeling that the pre-clear is merely trying to go to sleep. Sessions may be of whatever duration and frequency during the week as are agreed upon by the auditor and pre-clear. 2-hour sessions are usually considered minimum, since it occasionally takes that long to contact and run out enough engrams or to do enough lock scanning to make the session worthwhile. 6 hours of processing a day may be done without loss of efficiency, and this can be done 7 days a week without harm to the pre-clear. It could be added that medical doctors advise that under such heavy processing, a balanced vitamin ration be used by the pre-clear, who otherwise may suffer nightmares, since it is apparent that the running of engrams reduces the amount of vitamin B1 in the system. Experience at the Foundation demonstrates some additional precautions which should be taken with pre-clears. The auditor should make sure that the pre-clear is not audited when he is tired or ill, that he is not audited late at night, when by habit he would be sleeping, that he has adequate rest, and that he is not audited during periods when his present time environment is intensely restimulative to him. Those pre-clears with whom the Foundation has had any trouble were found to have been audited late at night, having inadequate food and B1 intake during intensely restimulative environmental circumstances, which might in any case have caused them to drop on the tone scale, and when they were physically weary. All of these people had psychotic histories. While such trouble has not been had by the Foundation, to 0.1% of that, proportionately, experienced by practitioners of non-Dianetic methods, the Foundation has instituted a careful program to avoid such conditions and circumstances. The general progress of the case would be to use straight wire, then use some lock scanning, then to run some secondary engrams to relieve some grief or fear, and then to begin an erasure of the case by contacting the first moment of pain or discomfort in this lifetime, which is ordinarily found somewhere in the vicinity of conception. If enough n theta has been converted to theta on the case, this first engram will erase. If it will not erase, then too much charge still exists in secondaries and locks. When the first engram in the case, known as basic, has been erased, the next consecutive engram should be contacted and erased in its turn, and so on up the bank toward present time. Somewhere up the line it will be found that new grief has presented itself, and it will be necessary to run out some more secondary engrams. When this has been done, the pre-clear is sent back again to the first moment of pain or unconsciousness, which can then be found on the case. Basic area engrams will probably have presented themselves. These are erased consecutively toward present time until further trouble develops. Then more secondaries are run, more locks are scanned, and the pre-clear is returned again to the basic area, where an erasure is continued. Sooner or later, This erasure will continue all the way forward to present time. Then, after running a few isolated missed engrams, the auditor will have on his hands a clear, provided the auditor was far enough up the tone scale in the first place to encourage the deinturbulation of this case to the point where it could run engrams. The auditor may find an occluded case so heavily charged with engrams that the case can only boil off. This will appear to be a form of sleep, and the auditor may feel that he is being cheated of his opportunity to perform. In such a case, no matter how many hours of processing are consumed by this apparent sleep, the sleep must not be disturbed. But when the pre-clear comes out of it, the phrase on which he went into the boil-off should be repeated again, thus putting him back into the sleep. In such a way, enormous quantities of anatin are unburdened from the case. The auditor may find himself confronted with a pre-clear who will run only phrases and cannot seem to get a whole incident anywhere. Much lock scanning should be done with this pre-clear. But it is also of benefit to permit the pre-clear to run these fragments of aberrative phrases, since sooner or later one of them will cause the pre-clear to boil off or to suddenly hit a grief charge. No case of any kind should dismay the auditor. With these presented techniques of lock scanning, running secondaries, running engrams, boil-offs, straight memory, and even running disjointed phrases, any case which can be persuaded to work at all will resolve. The auditor should be particularly wary of running his pre-clear into any heavily charged secondary, unless the auditor intends to run the pre-clear through it again and again and again until the charge is reduced, regardless of how much the pre-clear wants not to continue it, and regardless of any trick the pre-clear may use to get out of it. This sometimes requires much courage on the part of the auditor, since the terror and agony of the pre-clear or the extremity of the grief may cause the auditor, out of misguided sympathy, to relent in the face of such a secondary engram. The auditor should be careful of running a heavily charged case into more than the case can handle. Processing should be as non-directive as possible, the auditor saying only enough to get the case running. Most auditors talk too much. The auditor should never confuse his role with psychotherapy or with medicine. The medical doctor is important in the society. Bacteria are bacteria. Bruises, contusions, broken bones, and obstetrics will be with us for a long while. The auditor, because he can sweep aside with ease most of the manifestations which were formerly called psychosomatic illnesses, should not discount the reality of many kinds of physical disorders. The auditor is trying to bring the individual up the tone scale. Incidentally, this bypasses the individual around the majority of physical troubles and complexes and obsessions, but it does not obviate the occasional necessity of medical treatment for the pre-clear. And it certainly does not obviate the institutionalization of the obviously insane, no matter what Dianetics can do for these people. The auditor, then, should work in close unison with medical doctors, helping them to understand what he is doing, and helping them to understand Dianetics and trying to educate medical doctors into planting fewer and lighter engrams. The auditor should ignore the hundreds of conflicting psychotherapies and ignore any of their practices, since the auditor will learn in the realm of experience that giving advice to his pre-clear about how he should think about his engrams and other aberrative manifestations is highly detrimental to the mental health of the pre-clear. The auditor should realize he is working in a relatively low-toned and unenlightened society. Dianetics will be invalidated to him continually, as with any constructive or creative activity. If the auditor simply goes forward yanking cases up the tone scale, he will win his battle. He has in his hands tools more powerful than those which existed before. He should use them. The auditor should not despair of any case. He can do something for any case which will even remotely give him its attention. There will be moments in the progress of any case where environmental circumstances hit a case hard, or where an engram of unusual force is on its way to the surface when the case will apparently go into a decline. The auditor should not despair because of this, since he only needs to revert to the types of processing marked out for lower levels of the tone scale, and so he may restore his pre-clear to the proper level. The auditor should appreciate that any case progresses upwards not in a steady line, but by swoops and jerks, and that the average advance alone is steady. In olden times, antiquated therapies occasionally triggered a manic engram. Not knowing about the cause of human aberration, they were content to assume that this sudden elation of the patient was indicative of an advance. The auditor will learn that these sudden surges to new highs of well-being are simply symptomatic of an engram which has as its content some highly complimentary phrases. An auditor will often find his pre-clear claiming in high euphoria that he is now clear, only to have the case regress within 2 or 3 days to a depressed state. The auditor, by lock scanning and running out the causative engram, can remedy this with ease. The auditor will behold in the progress of any case, certainly while it is returned on the time track, some alarming manifestations. Running an engram which contains fever, the pre-clear's temperature will rise. Running engrams early in life, the pre-clear's facial structure will change. Running engrams which are very highly charged may cause the pre-clear to scream to the point where the neighbors a block away will be phoning for the police. None of these manifestations should worry the auditor. The only way the auditor can harm the pre-clear is to refrain from running off what has been contacted. If the auditor becomes alarmed because the pre-clear's heart is beating at twice its normal speed, or because the pre-clear is moaning and weeping and so tries to bring the pre-clear up to present time, the auditor is inviting trouble. The manifestation of an engram while the pre-clear is returned may be slight. Brought to present time without the engram being reduced, the manifestation is many times increased. The somatic at the point on the track where it occurred may not be very great. In present time, the somatic is greatly intensified. Thus, the safest course is to run out whatever one contacts, even if one has to hold one's ears, or when one's observation of the pre-clear seems to clearly demonstrate that here is a person become very suddenly ill. The reduction of the engram or incident will bring about a complete revival of the pre-clear. Above all else, the auditor should have faith in his tools. When he tells the pre-clear to go back to the time when he was 5 years of age, he should not then sit there and wonder whether the pre-clear has returned to that time. Certainly, some portion of the pre-clear's mind has gone to 5 years of age. The auditor deals with certainties. The auditor does not wonder about the actions of the somatic strip and the file clerk. He takes what they give him. He runs whatever is necessary to resolve the case. He has complete confidence in his tools and in his own ability. With this complete confidence, which is in itself a manifestation of theta, the auditor can produce marked and remarkable results. If the auditor dilly-dallies with the case, wonders whether or not Dianetics works, wonders what's happening, wonders whether he shouldn't read Chapter 16 again, then looks at the pre-clear and thinks perhaps these prenatal engrams are illusion or delusion, and begins to question people around the pre-clear, wondering if that was what happened to the pre-clear, and is in a high state of doubt about everything in general and the case in particular, he will not produce results. Results are what are desired. Well, clear-thinking, strong individuals are highly necessary in the society at this time. They are so remarkably few. Chapter 6, Column AB, Present Time. One of the primary concerns of the auditor is present time. By present time is meant the current now on the time track. Actually, the entire time track is only a consecutive progress of present times. When a pre-clear returns to an incident by going down the time track, he is returning to a present time which once existed. Because of action phrases such as groupers, bouncers, deniers, misdirectors, and because of the heavy charge which can be on a case, it occasionally occurs that he is continuously in some past present time. Further, when one fails to reduce an incident, a case may be difficult to return to current present time. For these reasons, the auditor must understand clearly both the value of being in present time and the methods of returning his pre-clear to present time at the end of a session. The value of present time has been illustrated by the fact that if one went through a sanitarium and told patients, one after the other, come up to present time, a certain low percentage of the inmates would thereupon become sane. The simple fact of being in present time is in itself a factor of sanity. At a certain sanitarium, some medical doctors made this test with the patients, and one of these, who had been insane for a considerable period, who ordinarily refused to talk and whose face was a mask of acne, responded to this command, and, as a result of no other ministration, returned to present time and to sanity. That night, according to report, she attended a sanitarium party and gave a speech about how glad she was to be there. Within 3 days, the acne had disappeared from her face. And while her sanity was, of course, far from being a good risk, she manifested and was continuing to manifest sanity many weeks afterward. It is much simpler to invite someone to return to present time than it is to hack up portions of his brain or shatter him with high voltages. There are, according to Dianetic classification, two types of insane. The first type is the dramatizing psychotic. The second is the computational psychotic. The dramatizing psychotic goes through the engram in which he is stuck over and over and over. It is acutely or chronically in restimulation, and his reactive mind causes his vocal cords and his body to go through the dramatization demanded by the engram. He is generally imprisoned in 2 or 3 engrams and goes from one to another of them ceaselessly. Such a case, of course, is heavily charged, and it does not do much good to try to run out the engrams. It is necessary to take charge off the case and bring the case to present time. This is not very difficult if one can gain the psychotic's attention. The other type of insanity is computational. Here the engram has walled up a certain portion of the analyzer as captured territory, and a circuit causes this portion of the analyzer to be the whole of the being. The remainder of the analyzer is shut off, and the I of the individual is not in evidence. The paranoiac is usually computationally insane, which is to say, he does not dramatize like a phonograph, but actually appears to think up things. The schizophrenic is an individual who has several portions of the analyzer segmented off by different circuits, which are actually valences, and who goes from one to another of these portions of the analyzer, only occasionally, if ever, becoming himself. Both the dramatizing psychotic and the computational psychotic have the bulk of the analyzer completely shut off by anaton and by being out of present time. Present time perceptics are not rationalized, since they are entering upon an engram area. Probably the crux of the treatment of all psychotics is getting them into present time and stabilizing them there. All psychotics have heavily charged cases, and it is necessary one way or the other to reduce this charge. While this may appear an oversimplification of the problem, it also might well be that the problem is simple. The most difficult thing in the treatment of the psychotic is establishing enough affinity, reality, and communication between the psychotic and the auditor to persuade the psychotic to do something to help himself. This can be done by mimicking the psychotic, which is a form of establishing affinity, or by bringing the psychotic into some contact with the present world. This short dissertation on the psychotic is given to illustrate the importance of present time. The auditor should not believe, however, that he can easily get his pre-clear out of present time and cause his pre-clear to go insane. The case would have to be a borderline psychotic in the first place, and the auditing would have to be in such flagrant violation of the chart that it could be presupposed that the auditor who would accomplish such a psychosis would himself be a moron or a psychotic in the first place. Any pre-clear is less alert out of present time than he is in present time. People go through their whole lives far out of present time and never suspect it. If they should be returned to present time, they would be far more able to cope with their problems and would be considerably happier, since evaluating the current environment in terms of, let us say, the environment of 5 years of age is not conducive to good computation. The percentage of people who are chronically out of present time would astonish you if you were to test it out. The test is a simple one, and is indeed the standard mechanism used by the auditor in returning his pre-clear to present time. If you were to use this mechanism on a number of your friends, you would find that many of them are stuck somewhere on the time track and are not in present time. You should find it relatively easy, if you are dealing with people above 2.0, to return anyone to present time whom you find out of it. The person need know nothing about Dianetics, and indeed this is an excellent way to introduce the subject to a stranger. Discovering where the individual lies on the time track may be done in 2 or 3 ways. The first method is the age flash. To understand this, one should also understand something about the file clerk, a subject which will be covered in a later chapter. The first flash response, the first impression a person receives in answer to a question, is called, in Dianetics, a flash answer. This is assisted by the auditor's snapping of his fingers immediately after he asks the question. The age flash is obtained then in the following fashion. The auditor says, "When I snap my fingers, an age will occur to you. Give me the first number that comes into your mind." He then snaps his fingers, and the pre-clear gives him the first number which comes into his mind. This may be the pre-clear's actual age, but in this current civilization, it usually is not. Sometimes it is a circuit response. The pre-clear has, through continual answering of this question, set up a circuit which replies instead of the file clerk. Such a person can be detected as running on such a circuit simply by asking the question whether or not at the beginning of every year he has difficulty putting down the date of the new year. If he carries over the past year into the new year for some days, or if he carries the past month into the new month, or if he simply has trouble in knowing what date it is, he can be considered to be out of present time. And if his flash answer is his current age, he can be considered to be running on a circuit. The usual response, however, will be an honest one, and the circuit response can be set aside and another answer gained by another mechanism. Using the flash answer, one will discover at what point on the time track the pre-clear has most of his attention units. The second mechanism by which the individual is discovered to be in or out of present time is the date flash. The auditor says to the pre-clear, "When I snap my fingers, the date will flash. Give me the first response which comes into your mind." The pre-clear then gives the first date which comes into his mind. In all these flash answers, a new pre-clear will ordinarily give the second or third answer which comes to him, and therefore the auditor must ask whether this was the first number. The pre-clear may give the present date, but on further questioning may admit that some earlier date flashed first and that he corrected it. This earlier date is where the bulk of the pre-clear's attention units are located on the time track. Another method of detecting whether or not the individual is in present time is also on a flash answer basis, but this time one asks for a flash of the scene. The auditor says, "When I snap my fingers, the current scene will flash before your eyes." A visio may then flash in the mind of the pre-clear, and is quite often not the visio of present time, but of a much earlier period. It also occasionally happens that a pre-clear not too heavily charged by n theta will be stuck in an engram exactly on the point of the only sonic he will get on the track and the only visio he will get on the track. Merely by telling him to close his eyes and listen, the auditor may get him to come up with a holder which is holding him out of present time. This is not general, but happens often enough to be remarked. There is yet another method of detecting whether or not the pre-clear is out of present time. This is by auditor observation. The pre-clear who holds on relentlessly to tokens of a certain period of the past is normally partially in that period, either because of a grief charge or some other type of n theta which holds him there. The old lady who surrounds herself with the trappings of 1910 and who wears an outmoded gown will usually be found on the time track at the moment of the death of her husband or son or some other loved one. The secondary engram is run out, or enough n theta is converted elsewhere on the case, and the auditor can return her to present time, at which moment she will recognize for the first time perhaps that her keepsakes and her gown are a trifle out of the mode. There is an additional auditor observation which establishes whether or not the pre-clear is out of present time. The auditor learns rather rapidly to observe the physiology of his pre-clear and judge from this where the pre-clear is stuck on the time track. At the period of birth, the baby is equipped to put on considerable fat and weight, and a person who is stuck in the birth engram is usually somewhat overweight and usually has some physiological characteristics which remind one of an infant. This is only one example of one period on the time track. The auditor will find pre-clears who look like 12-year-old boys and who are actually stuck at 12 years of age in some operation, such as a tonsillectomy or in some grief charge. The auditor will find girls who appear to be 4 or 5 years of age, although they are grown up, and who maintain some mannerisms and physiological characteristics of the earlier age. And then there are those people, not too lovely to look at, who are arrested in the prenatal period. They bear some slight hint of the period of life at which they are arrested. Their mouths and the condition of their skin seem to remind one of the condition of the zygote, embryo, or fetus. Such people have a tendency to be formed in the curved position of the prenatal period, are round-shouldered, and are apt to draw up into a ball when they sleep. This condition becomes very pronounced in the insane, where a callback in a prenatal engram has taken all the attention units of the individual and placed him exactly at and only at some portion of the prenatal period. There is no argument concerning the existence of prenatals. They have been known for the past 30 years and have been adequately proven by experiments at Rutgers University, and are so common in Dianetics that one considers the practitioner who questions them rather poorly read on his own literature. The auditor who does not recognize prenatals will never have very well preclears, and the auditor who does not see in his potential preclear the symptoms of being stuck in the prenatal area may have a difficult time with his case. There is the postulate of attention units. It could be considered that an attention unit is a theta energy quantity of awareness. Any organism is aware in some degree. A rational or relatively rational organism is aware of being aware. Attention units could be said to exist in the mind in varying quantity from person to person. This would be the theta endowment of the individual. One person, assigning merely arbitrary numbers, might have 1,000 attention units, and another person might have but 50. If all of a person's attention units could be free in present time for recall, enjoyment, perception, and direction of body activities and for computation, that person could be said to be most excellently cleared. People below the level of clear have fewer and fewer attention units in present time as they descend on the tone scale. The percentile scale on the chart might be interpreted also as the number of attention units which the person has available in present time. The normal person probably has about 25% of his attention units in present time. In view of the fact that these attention units are what he enjoys with, and thinks with, and works with, this can be seen to be not quite optimum. The rest of his attention units are caught somewhere back down the time track in one incident or another in the form of n theta. When an individual is out of present time, it can be said that he has more attention units existing at some past moment on the time track than he has existing in present time. The auditor, by failing to reduce engrams or secondaries, can induce a momentary condition in his preclear of being out of present time. The preclear after the session, if he is not in present time, will look rather groggy, will not perceive very readily, and will be, as a matter of fact, much more suggestible than when he is in present time. It is symptomatic of being out of present time that present time perceptions find no attention units to handle an evaluation of the perceptions, and so make a much deeper or unrationalized impression on the individual. In every session, the auditor, even when he is doing only straight wire, takes his preclear somewhat out of present time. It is the concern of the auditor to get the preclear back into present time. This is done best by running pleasure moments as though they were engrams. These moments of pleasure will assemble the attention units and uninturbulate them so that they will easily return to present time and the preclear will stabilize in it. It is a general rule that the more n theta there is on a case, the more the individual is out of present time. It is possible for n theta itself to be in present time, but this is where the environment itself is enturbulative, where the individual is upset or angry because of contagion from the environment. Thus, all the attention units in present time can be seen to be not necessarily theta, but n theta on the time track is not itself in present time. In the absence of environmental restimulation, then, it can be seen that these attention units, which should be in present time in a clear, but in a person lower on the tone scale are not, are actually n theta units wrapped up in locks, secondaries, and engrams. When the preclear does not return to present time and cannot be persuaded by any coaxing or cajoling to return to present time easily, the auditor has either tied up too many attention units in some past moment, a situation which will remedy itself in the course of a few hours usually, or there is so much charge on the case, which is to say so much n theta, that present time is unattainable. In cases below 2.0, the auditor has to be very careful how many attention units he sends out of present time, how much he restimulates his case, as these cases are so heavily n theta that any existing theta will enturbulate swiftly, thus taking the preclear far from present time into dramatizations or engramic computations. In working the usual case, not the psychotic, one still must be aware of the methods by which one may stabilize the preclear in present time. This rule can be applied to every case. The conversion of any amount of n theta to theta will increase the preclear's ability to come to present time and stabilize there. The auditor should work to convert n theta into theta until he can get his preclear into present time. He can do this by straight memory, by scanning locks, by running pleasure moments, or even by running an engram on cases which are high on the scale. There is no cause for panic because the individual is out of present time. Most of the society is out of present time. Any National Army or Navy, for instance, is so far out of present time that it is always ready to fight the war before last. Moral codes are ordinarily 2 or 3 centuries out of present time. Governmental systems are usually a couple of thousand years out of present time. So for an individual to be 10 or 15 years out is not very serious, unless the case as a whole is extremely serious. The auditor ordinarily finds his pre-clear out of present time and finds it necessary to leave him out of present time for the first few sessions, being unable to do enough processing during these few sessions to convert sufficient n-theta to return his pre-clear to present time. The auditor's first and primary concern in any case which he finds out of present time is to return that case to present time. He should work with light methods, session after session, concentrating only on one thing, getting the pre-clear back to present time. He does not attempt to drive the pre-clear to present time or command the pre-clear to present time, since driving and commanding will only turn theta into temporary n-theta. Once he has his pre-clear in present time and has his pre-clear very stable in present time, the auditor can start worrying about specific incidents and the vaster difficulties of the case. Trying to work somebody who will not come to present time or who cannot stay in present time once he is there should not be a trial to the auditor. The auditor should not run engrams on such a case, since obviously any person who cannot stay in present time does not have enough free theta to work engrams. Various manifestations take place concerning present time in pre-clears. The first manifestation, of course, is being chronically out of present time. The pre-clear is usually held in some operation, accident, or sorrow back on the track somewhere. Or the pre-clear comes to present time and then slumps back out of it because of some restimulated engram which, one way or another, by literal command, contains a callback, a phrase which says, "Come back here," and which the pre-clear obeys by returning back down the time track right after the auditor has gotten him to present time. This indicates a rather heavily charged case, and it is the charge itself which should be addressed, which is to say, simply converting n-theta to theta, rather than the specific engram which is doing the calling back. Then there is the case which is all the way out of present time all the time. This case is not in contact with the environment in any way whatsoever, and is, of course, psychotic. Then there is the case which is apparently stuck in present time. No one could actually be stuck in present time, but is stuck somewhere on the track in an incident which carries with it the illusion that it is present time. Christmas, for instance, is a time when presents are given, and as the pre-clear is brought back up the track, he may hang up at any point on the track which contains the word present. The habit of medical doctors during operations of saying, "That's all for the present," will create the illusion of putting the pre-clear up in present time and making it difficult for the pre-clear to return. Then there is the pre-clear who is in a chronic bouncer. Some engram in the case has in it a "get up" or "go up there," and the pre-clear is thus bounced to the extremity of his time track and even into the future of his time track. Obedience to such phrases indicates a heavily charged case, and the auditor again should address himself to the charge on the case rather than to the specific engram which is producing the manifestation. There is a flash answer method of discovering the incident in which the pre-clear is located. The auditor asks a series of questions, which will identify the incident and receives flash answers on a yes-no basis. The auditor says, "When I snap my fingers, you will answer yes or no to the following question. Hospital?" And the pre-clear answers yes or no. Such a series of questions and answers might run as follows. Accident? Yes. Hospital? No. Mother? Yes. Outdoors? No. Fall down? No. Cut? Yes. Kitchen? Yes. And suddenly the pre-clear may remember the incident, or get a visio of the scene and remember, or get a sonic recall of what his mother said to him, which might be something like, "You stay right there and hold on to it until I come back." If the case was not too heavily charged, remembering this might permit him to come to present time. In this way, using the names of people who might have been around the pre-clear and things which might have happened to the pre-clear, the auditor can, on a flash answer basis, bring enough data about the incident to light to allow the pre-clear to remember a hidden or forgotten engram or secondary, and, simply by recalling it, to return to present time. Getting the pre-clear to recall, by straight memory, the incident where he is stuck on the track is sometimes sufficient to get him to return to present time. However, any pre-clear who is out of present time and who has to be coaxed into a memory of where he is stuck on the track is usually a rather highly charged case, and the auditor should generally concern himself with the conversion of n theta to theta rather than the location of the actual incident. One case was under processing by a rather poor auditor for many months, for an hour or two a week. This case was hung up in a serious operation at the age of 31. The auditor eventually became bright enough to inquire whether or not there was an earlier operation, and an almost duplicate operation was suddenly located by the pre-clear, at which moment he returned to present time. In getting people to present time, it is a necessity to understand the principle that the earlier the engram is, the easier it is to reduce. Later engrams on a case contain their own force, plus the force of all similar previous engrams on the case. Engrams exist in chains, and there may be anywhere from 1 to 40 or 100 engrams on one chain. The pre-clear is quite ordinarily stuck not in the first engram on the chain, but in some later engram. Thus, the identification of the point on the track where he is stuck is ordinarily insufficient to free him. An earlier moment of a similar nature must be discovered before he is able to return to present time. The use of straight memory to discover such an earlier moment is a simple operation. As will be seen by an examination of the tone scale on the subject of present time, the more heavily charged the case, the more likely the pre-clear is to be out of present time or to stay out of present time. The whole question of returning the individual to present time is the question of converting n theta to theta. It would be a very simple thing if all one had to do was to run the engram in which the pre-clear was stuck and so get him to present time. This usually doesn't happen. The engram in which the pre-clear is stuck is quite ordinarily unreducible in the existing state of the case. Thus, getting the pre-clear to present time necessitates running pleasure moments, scanning light locks, running secondaries, or simply making present time so thoroughly attractive that the pre-clear's attention units return there. The auditor should not neglect the fact, nor should the pre-clear, that present time itself may be desirable or undesirable. The pre-clear who is faced with a divorce, or whose child has just died, or whose wife has suddenly been discovered to be a harlot, may find present time so thoroughly undesirable that attention units shun it, just as they, being theta, would shun any other n theta area on the track. Engrams, secondaries, and heavy locks become buried and hidden from recall because they are n theta and, by theory, have a repelling effect upon theta. The area at the age of 12 in which the individual was told he was going crazy because he was discovered to be masturbating, along with the remainder of the human race, will be difficult to approach. The n theta of the scolding and upset will cause theta to shy away from the area. Other non-survival periods of one's life, where one was down on his luck, where one found that college girls do not make good wives, where one discovered that one's husband of an evening liked to take off his shoes and read the paper rather than conquer dragons for his lady fair, as he promised to do so often before the wedding, and other periods of great travail are quite normally shunned as the pre-clear goes back down the track. This is very well evidenced by the number of new incidents which turn up during lock scanning. At first there appear to be only 1 or 2 incidents on a locked chain. But when the pre-clear has been scanned through the chain many times, it is discovered that there are several hundred incidents on the chain. N theta incidents then vanish so far as the theta of the conscious or analytical mind is concerned. One should not overlook the fact that present time can be such an area and so may be shunned. The auditor should do what he can to remedy this situation by providing a friendly atmosphere or even a refuge for his pre-clear, and so make present time, at least during the session, palatable. As a summary then, the more n theta in ratio to theta there is on the case, the less likely the pre-clear is to move on the track and to be in present time. The more n theta there is in present time, the less likely the pre-clear is to enter it. And this includes the fact that a cross-authoritatively inclined auditor will make present time unpalatable to his pre-clear. A primary mission of the auditor is to get his pre-clear into present time. The fundamental principle of getting the pre-clear to present time lies in improving the theta-n-theta ratio of the case by straight wire, running or scanning locks, and in cases which are well up the tone scale, running secondaries or engrams. As is shown on the chart, the Dianetic clear is highly stable in present time and does not leave it. All his perceptics are clear. This does not mean that the clear cannot leave present time. With I in control of the entire analytical mind instead of some circuit or telephone switchboard of circuits, the clear can run on his track entirely at will. But he almost never needs to do so, since his memory mechanisms can be counted on to furnish him with accurate data without recourse to return mechanisms. Here is the difference between memory and returning, where it is best manifested. Memory would be, for instance, sending 2 attention units to the standard memory bank to bring up information for the use of the analyzer. And returning would be sending 50% of the available theta back down the track for a full re-experiencing of the incident. The clear ordinarily does not fully re-experience incidents simply because he doesn't have to, and he ordinarily finds present time palatable. Theta units in present time offer a resistance to the n-theta coming in from the environ. The impact of the environ is combated by the theta unit reasoning and evaluation. If there is a great deal of n-theta on the case, and the present time environ is n-theta, the present time perceptics will go toward the n-theta and will restimulate it, whether it be in the form of locks, secondaries, or engrams, and so enturbulate the whole case. This does not happen to the clear, but that does not mean that the clear cannot be enturbulated. Given a very low theta endowment clear and a very heavy n-theta environment, such as the slaughter of 1,000 Christians, the clear will temporarily enturbulate. He does not, however, have large areas of frozen n-theta on his track, which could trap the temporarily enturbulated theta, and so he will completely disenturbulate the moment the n-theta environ is no longer present. A clear is very definitely in present time. The 3.5, the Dianetic release, is quite stable in present time, and he is very alert to his environment. He gets the full beauty out of any scenery he observes. He is not disturbed by extraneous noises or upsets, but because he still has frozen n-theta on his case, he is susceptible to heavy enturbulation if the present time environment is enturbulative. Nevertheless, he is stable in present time. The 3.0 has no definite difficulty in reaching, returning to, or maintaining himself in present time. He snaps back to present time very rapidly when he is being processed, and is very alert when he gets there. However, he can be enturbulated to the point where he will hang up temporarily somewhere on the track and will possibly dramatize the point where he has hung up, if sufficiently hit by enturbulation. The 2.5, when once brought to present time, will easily remain there until the next processing. He has perhaps 30 to 40% of his theta in present time, as an ordinary rule, and an auditor has to be very careless to hang this pre-clear up on the track. However, this pre-clear can be hung up on the track, and the auditor will have to run pleasure moments at the end of the session and do some straight wire when he has had a very enturbulative session in order to stabilize his pre-clear in present time. The 2.0 requires considerable care on the part of the auditor in order to return him to present time and stabilize him there. Pleasure moments have to be run, if any can be found. Some lock scanning must be done. Some future pleasure moments may be run. But the 2.0 may respond to a callback and, once brought to present time, may slump back down the track to an earlier period. Dealing with 2.5s and 2.0s, the auditor should always check at the end of the session at least twice to see whether the pre-clear is in present time. At the first check, he may find that the pre-clear is in present time, but 10 minutes later, the pre-clear may have slumped back down the track in answer to a callback in some early period of n-theta. Here we have a case where there is far more n-theta on the case than theta, and the individual tends strongly to go toward the n-theta of the past or the n-theta of present time rather than toward theta. Theoretically, he would rather come up to present time for a fight than for anything else. However, this is not recommended as a processing procedure, and the auditor must use much skill in getting the pre-clear to present time. The 1.5 is usually in some dominating valence somewhere out of present time. He is very difficult to get to present time, and once in present time will almost always slump back. Here is the chronically angry case, and he goes toward angry n theta more readily than toward any theta in present time. The auditor will find efforts to bring this pre-clear to present time very difficult until he has raised this pre-clear's tone up above the 2.0 level. At 1.1, the pre-clear stays out of present time most of the time. When he reaches present time, he nearly always slumps back immediately. A tremendously inviting situation, covertly hostile, devious, or perverted, in present time will bring this pre-clear to present time, but little else will. The balm and persuasion of an auditor's personality will not by itself do the trick. The auditor working a 1.1 should not worry if he cannot get the pre-clear to present time at the end of the session, since the pre-clear is usually out of present time anyway. Still, the auditor should be careful not to pull down any of the pre-clear's theta into n theta areas, since there is very little left to pull down. Very light processing methods should be used. The 0.5 can always be requested to come to present time, and sometimes will, but he slumps back immediately into some apathy incident. This case requires considerable skill on the part of the auditor, who is working with somebody so far out of present time all the time that it is difficult for him to get the pre-clear's attention. If the auditor acts particularly sad, sometimes this pre-clear will come to present time. At 0.1, the pre-clear's perceptics can at best be directed to present time concepts. One can ask him to observe a cup or a saucer or a bright-colored object or some music or an emergency situation. But here one is very lucky to be able to get the pre-clear merely to perceive something which exists in the present time environment. The auditor's primary concern with any case is whether or not the case is in present time. Chapter 7, Column AC, Straight Memory. In Dianetics, straight memory is a specific technical process. It should not be confused with free association. Straight memory is also called straight wire. It is so called because the auditor is directing the memory of the pre-clear, and in doing so is stringing wire, much on the order of a telephone line, between I and the standard memory bank, plowing through all occlusions and circuits. There is something about straight memory which is very validating. Once a person really remembers something, it seems real to him, and this sense of reality greatly promotes the ARC of the case. Straight memory thus has a certain advantage over lock scanning and running engrams. The pre-clear, using straight memory, very thoroughly associates the past event in terms of the present time environment. When the pre-clear is returned on the track, he often evaluates the past event only in terms of its own environment, and while repeated recountings of the incident may bring about reduction of the n theta in it, the validation factor is still much lower than in straight memory. Straight memory was developed in Dianetics on the basis that if one knew the fundamental mechanical cause of insanity, one should be able to do better than the various older therapies, since it is known that free association produces some minor alleviation of tension and anxiety. The mechanisms of why this came about were thus explored. It was found that the heightened reality of straight memory and the knowledge of why locks, the usual target of straight memory, were aberrative, combined to make an orderly and fast type of processing valid in the ratio of several 100 to 1 over old therapies. All by itself, straight memory is an excellent method of processing. The busy doctor or consultant who has but a few minutes to spend with every patient can employ straight memory to great advantage. One specialist in Parkinson's disease in New York City, although he did not understand very much about Dianetic processing, used straight memory to achieve the alleviation of Parkinson's disease, at least temporarily, in 3 cases out of 5 on which it was employed. The importance of straight memory should not be underestimated. Pre-clears low on the tone scale can sometimes support only straight memory. In the Foundation, various people have become straight memory experts, since straight memory has its own peculiar skills. Straight memory can be used on anyone without any danger. It is a slightly directive process. The auditor does not permit his preclear to wander around and free associate and generally waste time and energy. The auditor knows exactly what he wants and he directs the preclear's attention to it. Thus, a straight memory expert must be able to sum up more or less what is wrong with the case. After he has summed this up, he can do a very good job of resolving the case by straight memory. Originally, straight memory required considerable perspicacity on the part of an auditor. However, in late 1950, recognizing the great skill necessary to a good straight memory auditor, I postulated what became inelegantly called the hurdy-gurdy system. The use of this system demands the minimum of the auditor and extracts the maximum of aberration from the preclear. It at least gets things done. The first thing one should know about straight memory is the phenomenon of the human mind that a fact asked for today and not received may be received tomorrow or the next day. The mind, on facts long laid away, has a 1 to 3 day refresher period. If one were to give an examination on history to a number of 40-year-old men on Monday, one might expect many low grades. But by giving another examination to this same group 2 days later, one would find that higher grades were attained. This experiment has not been broadly conducted, but its basics seem to be borne out in the practice of straight memory. The mind, in short, refreshes itself, and the repetitious request by the auditor for certain facts from the preclear's standard memory bank will eventually elicit those facts. The auditor, if he does not get the information he wants from the preclear on Monday, should ask the same questions on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and he will find that the preclear will eventually remember. Because so many people in the society seek to profit by the failure of others to remember, memory is a generally reduced quantity in the current culture. The mother who has many times attempted abortion upon her child is quite anxious that the child should not remember anything. The mother instinctively knows, although the culture has taught her that the child could not possibly remember such early incidents, that she had better suppress any possible recall. Thus, mothers, by contagion, have encouraged bad memory. There is something triumphant in having a better memory than the other fellow. This is based on the formulation that being right is to survive and being wrong is not to survive. By being right in memory, one demonstrates the fact that one has a greater survival potential than the fellow who is wrong in memory. Memories come into conflict continually, and one will find unthinking people quarreling as to which one remembers the best and as to which fact is correct. This is an additional befuddlement in the society which suppresses memory. There are cases on record, well authenticated, of individuals who have remembered back into their prenatal period. One 8-year-old girl who was under processing by a book auditor recently stunned her parents by remembering back to the 3rd month after conception when "Mama squeezed her tummy and hurt me." In the presence of non-dianetically oriented individuals, this memory would have been immediately suppressed. But in view of the fact that it agreed with the memories of the parents, and in view of the fact that both parents had, to their benefit, experienced Dianetic processing, the little girl was permitted to go on remembering, and straightwire was done with considerable profit into the prenatal bank, a profit so considerable that the child's school grades went up 50% on the general average. Many instances are on record of straight memory back to birth, and it is too ordinary for comment for an individual to remember into infancy. The society, of course, because of the contagion of aberration of mothers who have practiced extracurricular sex relations and attempted abortions, holds memory this early in considerable question. It has been held in such question prior to Dianetics, without anyone's being scientific enough to examine any evidence on the subject or even to accumulate any, that outmoded therapies branded all memory earlier than about 3 years of age as delusion, and were thus able to promote a large clientele of individuals driven into aberration by being invalidated. Memory of infancy does not depend upon memory of how to talk. Befuddled professors and practitioners in the past believed that the ability to talk had something to do with the ability to remember, but this is not the case. There have been objections to prenatal engrams on the basis that no one would be able to understand language before he was born, despite the fact that Sigmund Freud stressed traumatic prenatal incidents. The syllables, meaningless though they are recorded in a prenatal engram along with all other perceptics. When they are keyed in a person past 2 years of age who has learned to talk, They are evaluated in terms of the meanings the person has learned to give those syllables. Thus, it is possible to recall as far back as one pleases. Forgotten incidents were postulated by Sigmund Freud, to whom, through Commander Thompson, one of his students and the friend and mentor of my youth, I am much indebted, to be a considerable factor in human sanity. The release through recall of any incident which is forgotten, hidden, or off the track, and which contains considerable turbulence, will produce a tone rise in the individual. Many individuals undergoing processing, in fact most individuals, cannot remember any earlier than 8 years of age, much less into infancy. The more n-theta there is on a case, the less theta is available to the analyzer. The more n-theta there is along the time track, the harder it is for the existing theta to disinterpolate it enough to get the data out of it. The more aberrated the individual, the more n-theta there is on the case. N-theta does not necessarily lie in childhood, but key-ins can ordinarily be expected to lie in childhood. And the key-in is sometimes difficult to remember, but when remembered will produce the most marked change in the case. After a person has been processed for a while and considerable free theta exists for the use of the analyzer, straight memory back to early periods is very possible. One can also get into early periods in a person's life by the use of repeater technique. Some misunderstanding has resulted on the part of some individuals about repeater technique, what it is and how it was used. In the handbook, Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, there is a discussion of repeater technique. But simply defined, it is this: the repetition of a word or phrase in order to produce movement on the time track into an n-theta area containing that word or phrase. Repeating or rolling a phrase in an n-gram in order to de-intensify the phrase or reduce the n-gram is not repeater technique. Repeater technique almost invariably causes a temporary interpolation as an inevitable consequence of contacting an n-theta area of the time track, and therefore should obviously not be used unless the auditor feels that he can disinterpolate the area so contacted. Repeater technique is a forcing technique, and now that more delicate and more effective means have been developed, it has limited usefulness. Allowing the pre-clear to repeat isolated phrases, which he himself presents, may be of benefit by taking him into a boil-off or a grief charge which is ready to reduce. Feeding the pre-clear random and arbitrary phrases to repeat will produce nothing but trouble. This is not straight memory technique, but is an archaic technique of Dianetics independent of straight memory. Repeater technique has its uses, but anyone using repeater technique at random on a case will quite commonly find his pre-clear hung up in an n-gram which cannot be contacted and run out. Repeater technique causes trouble, but by the use of repeater technique, barring accidents, the pre-clear can be pulled back into a return into periods of infancy if the auditor is lucky enough not to get the pre-clear into an n-gram. Repeater technique on holders, such as stay there, will almost certainly wind the pre-clear's attention up in n-grams, attention which will not be freed until the auditing is scanned out. This should not be confused with straight memory. Straight memory consists of the pre-clear staying in present time with his eyes wide open and being asked to remember certain things which have been said to him and done to him during his lifetime. He is not asked to return to these incidents. He is asked only to recognize their existence. He is not commanded to accept the fact that such incidents existed, and minimal aid should be given to his memory mechanisms. The auditor may get a pre-clear who has difficulty remembering yesterday, to say nothing of the time when he was 2 years of age. The auditor may be assured that when he has worked with this case long enough to restore a considerable amount of theta, converting it from n-theta, the pre-clear will be able to remember things which he has never been able to remember before, since one of the first things which improves in Dianetic processing is memory. When an auditor has a pre-clear who has difficulty remembering, the auditor should be careful to start with things that are rememberable. If the pre-clear says bluntly that he cannot remember things, it is up to the auditor to encourage and validate this pre-clear's memory. If the pre-clear says, "I can't remember names," the auditor says, "Well, what is the name of your business associate?" The pre-clear says, "Oh, his name is Jones." The auditor has proven to the pre-clear that the pre-clear can remember at least one name. If the pre-clear is in such bad condition that he cannot even remember this at will, the auditor says, "What is my name?" The pre-clear, having just heard the auditor's name, may be able to remember it with ease. If he cannot, the auditor says, "What is your own name?" The pre-clear tells him, and the auditor says, You see, you can remember one name. Now, let's see if you can remember others. In such a fashion, the pre-clear can be assisted to remember from the most obvious incidents or facts back to more and more obscure incidents. This is the common progress of straight memory, to begin by remembering the obvious and finally to be able to remember the aberrative. A whole and entire method of processing can be made out of straight memory. Time spent on straight memory is usually time well spent. Straight memory might also be considered a pair of stilts by which the pre-clear, persuaded to remember incidents later and later in his life, can be brought back up to present time. That straight memory does free theta, or convert n theta to theta, is beyond question. It is, however, a rather lengthy process, yet it would take an auditor only 15 hours of Dianetic processing by straight memory to accomplish what would take 2 or 3 years with non-Dianetic techniques. Thus, straight memory should be used only as indicated on the chart, or to get the individual back up to present time, or by auditors who are so rushed for time that they have only a few minutes to attempt to rid a pre-clear of some specific somatic or aberration. The primary rule of straight memory is this: whatever the pre-clear thinks is wrong with himself, his family, his group or mankind, life or mest, has generally been told to the pre-clear by somebody else at an earlier period of the pre-clear's life. This is modified by the fact, of course, that things can be wrong along these various dynamics which are perfectly rational observations. The auditor is looking for irrational beliefs about these things. The second rule about straight memory is the pre-clear, at least at this time, is surrounded by very aberrated individuals and has been so surrounded since conception. It is symptomatic of any aberrated individual that he is acting upon his engrams and is dramatizing those engrams. Thus, there is a consistency of performance. The rough rule of thumb is that if an aberrated person says something once, he will say it hundreds or thousands of times. Once you have isolated the fact that a certain individual in the pre-clear's past, for instance, complained about his stomach, you will have discovered a whole chain of such complaints, and a conversion of n theta to theta on this subject will take place. By straight memory, one can easily discover the dominant or the nullifying individuals in the pre-clear's family. From the dominant individuals, those who attempted to dominate and command and control the others around them, the pre-clear will have received the circuit phrases which are the control phrases in his bank. From the nullifying persons, he will have received the nullification phrases. The auditor, by locating these persons and their habitual statements, finds the pre-clear's circuits. Those things which are found in the locks of a pre-clear are normally found in his engrams. Thus, if one finds Mama at the pre-clear's 10th year saying, "Men are no good," one can expect to find Mama shortly after the pre-clear's conception making the same remark in an engram. If one discovers the lock by straight memory, he can then find the engram. Difficulties arise in straight memory in cases where the pre-clear has not been raised by his own parents. A pre-clear whose parents died shortly after his birth does not have in his post-speech period the same phrases which are in his early engrams. A lock must have an engram below it in order to exist. But here the auditor is confronted with a person whose locks do not, as far as phrases are concerned, match his engrams. This would appear at first glance to be a fortunate condition for the pre-clear, since the engrams would never be repeated as to voice tone or content later in the pre-clear's life, which is the case with the usual pre-clear. But something else has been interrupted here which is very important to the pre-clear's life, and that is parental care. It may be the common, shallow, and collegiate remark that parents are only biological. This does not happen to be borne out by the facts. There does not seem to be any substitute to a child for the proximity and care of his own parents. Pre-clears who have been raised by nurses and maids do not demonstrate the same alertness as those who have been raised by their own parents. Pre-clears who have been raised by foster parents, no matter the quality of those foster parents, do not seem to be as well off as pre-clears who have been raised by relatively indifferent and unaffectionate actual parents. There is more here than the biological production of new organisms, and the affinity of parent for child, even when clouded by maltreatment of the child, is apparently superior to non-parental care of the child, even when this is near optimum. Thus, the severance of the parent-child relationship after birth is a more solid break of affinity, reality, and communication than the summation of locks which would occur in the usual case by the approximations of incidents later in life to early engrams. This is not theory, but observation of many cases, since no case processed to date which had been raised by maids rather than parents was found to be as high in the tone scale as cases which had been raised by indifferent parents, much less those who have been raised by parents who loved them dearly. Russian pseudoscientists to the contrary, there is more to man than biology and environment. Training women extensively in political economy, symbology, or the care and cleaning of rifles is not conducive to a forthcoming sane generation. Straight memory, as a technique, strikes toward 7 types of incidents: the enforcement of affinity, communication, and reality by command, the implantation of circuits, and the inhibition of affinity, communication, and reality by command. Affinity, communication, and reality exist as they exist under the self-determinism of the individual. What is wrong with the preclear is what has been done to the preclear, not what he himself has done. Basically, man is intended to survive as an organism. The matter of the modification of the organism by the theta body has been very far from fully investigated. This reservation in regard to the possibility of n-theta bodies must be included out of scientific honesty in these observations. An individual who has been subjected to enforced affinity, reality, and communication has an interrupted self-determinism. By enforced affinity, reality, or communication is meant the demand on the individual that he experience or admit affinity, reality, or communication when he has not felt it. The child who has been forced to love a parent or guardian has been subjected, when he did not feel that love, but was forced to admit it, to an enforced affinity. This is aberrative. The wife who has been continually subjected to demands from a lower-toned husband that she tell him she loves him when she does not, and who yet accedes to this demand, has been subjected to enforced affinity. Lower-toned people than the preclear commonly command his affinity, and when affinity is given but not felt, locks are formed which are quite attribulative should engrams underlie such an enforcement. What child is there who has not had a reality forced upon him which he did not feel? He has been told that it was very important for him to go to school when he himself did not have sufficient reason to believe this. In the limited sphere of his experience, he sees that it is desirable to play, to get sunlight, to eat, sleep, have friends, and to exist in harmony in the bosom of his family. But he does not see that it is necessary for him to study. Nearly all grammar school education is an enforced reality. The grown-up can see that it is necessary for the child to have some slight command of the 3 R's, but the child has not agreed to this. Agreement has been forced upon him, and thus aberrative locks are formed upon any existing engrams. School is very far from being the only enforced reality. Any time a person is made to agree, by force or threat or deprivation, to another's reality, and yet does not feel that reality himself, an aberrative condition exists. When engrams are present which can be restimulated by this situation, a certain amount of theta is trapped as n-theta. The most insidious of all these enforced realities is where the individual knows the truth or is told the truth and is then made to confess that what he knows to be the truth is a lie. He has said that such and such is the case, and then he accedes to the demand that he deny this assertion. This very commonly happens to children and forms bad locks. Whenever an individual is forced to agree to something to which he would not agree if left to his own reason, a lock is formed where underlying engrams exist. Enforced communication is productive of all manner of aberration and physiological changes in the individual. Of course, any lock has to have an engram underlying it, but it is fairly certain that what the parent says in the lock has already been stated in an engram earlier in the case. Communication, of course, includes all perceptics as well as conversation and messages. And when an individual has been forced to look at something which his self-determination says he should not look at, his sight to some degree is impaired. When he is forced to listen to something to which he would not ordinarily listen if left to his own self-determinism, his hearing to that degree is impaired. When he has been forced to touch something which he would not ordinarily touch, his tactile is thus impaired. When he has been forced to talk when his self-determinism says he should remain silent, his speech communication is impaired. When he has been forced to write when he would not ordinarily write if left to his own devices, his ability to write or to communicate messages is thus impaired. These are enforced communications, and in the presence of engrams become very aberrative locks. Circuits occupy a later column. But any circuit is simply a control or nullification U phrase which makes the individual compute differently than he ordinarily would, and which walls up a certain portion of the analyzer for use against the individual. A circuit, for instance, can be critical, so that thoughts that criticize him occur to the individual whenever he thinks or acts. The circuit, "I've got to protect you from yourself," can wall up a large portion of the mind. The individual in this society is surrounded by people who would either dominate or nullify, and thus many locks are formed of the circuit variety where people are, by the U phrase, attempting to dominate or nullify the individual. Locks can only exist, of course, when engrams exist, and so these are normally received in their most aberrative form from parents, guardians, and other individuals who have been around the early portion of the person's life when the bulk of the engrams are received. Circuits are quite peculiarly resolvable by straight wire. When an auditor strikes a circuit during the running of an engram, very occasionally the whole engram blanks out or a strange visio turns on. When the auditor strikes a circuit in an engram, he can expect the pre-clear to go out of the auditor's control into the control of some past and even dead individual's phrases, since the circuit takes over control from the auditor. Individuals who go around auditing themselves and running engrams and phrases ad infinitum are running because of circuits. Individuals whose banks cannot be entered in any way are in that condition because of circuits which bar the auditor. By straight memory, it is possible to discover the dominant or nullifying individuals of the family, and so recover the dominant or nullifying circuits in the form of locks. Once these locks are blown, the engrams containing these circuits are to some degree discharged. Further, the auditor is forewarned of what he might find in the engram bank of the individual. Every case is to some degree a control case, which is to say, a case which has circuits of one kind or another. One of the best ways to find out what circuits the pre-clear has is to give him straight wire on the statements of the people by whom he was surrounded in very early life and childhood. It is interesting to note on the subject of circuits that as one goes down the tone scale from the top to the bottom, one finds that people on lower and lower levels are more and more surrounded by dominant and nullifying individuals. Thus, straight wire becomes more and more indicated the lower one drops on the tone scale for the location and blowing of circuit locks. The inhibition of affinity, communication, and reality is no less serious than their enforcement. The inhibition of affinity comes about when a desirable similarity of the pre-clear to another person is denied or rejected, or when the love and affection of the pre-clear is rejected. In the presence of underlying engrams, considerable turbulence is created by these nullifications of affinity. The wife who is commonly answered with, "You don't love me," every time she attempts to express her affection is undergoing an inhibition of affinity. The individual who is told that nobody in the office likes him is undergoing an inhibition of affinity. The person who is rejected from a group because of some fault or otherwise experiences a major break of affinity. When such breaks of affinity are overlaying engrams, which they commonly are, they become highly aberrative and serve to charge up the engrams considerably. Straight wire reaching such incidents can unburden the case of considerable turbulence. The individual who is not permitted to feel that he is loved or that he may love, the person who is denied any common ground with the universe, with man, with his group or family, or even with himself, is experiencing an inhibition of affinity. The inhibition of reality requires considerable attention. Left to his own devices and reasoning on his own data, the individual decides what is reality for him and with what he can agree. When he is informed that he cannot agree with those things he thinks he should agree with, he experiences an inhibition of reality. When engrams underlay this, these locks can be very serious and can tie up considerable theta on a case as n theta. One might say that this is the most serious influence in reducing the individual on the tone scale, the inhibition of the individual's reality. This is invalidation, and invalidation is the most serious break of the auditor's code. What a person, by his own observations, has come to believe real, becomes then a part of the conclusions and observations which a person uses to guide his future actions and to evaluate himself with regard to his environment. A sudden challenge or denial of the reality of these conclusions comes as a severe shock to the individual when it is underlaid by engrams and will shake his reality in any event. The reality of an individual can be so thoroughly shaken that he will be doubtful of anything he does or says, since he is not sure of his conclusions. Reality, together with affinity and communication, is a basic in the computations which an individual makes with regard to the courses he should take in the pursuit of his own survival. The reality of children is very ordinarily threatened or knocked to pieces by parents. The child has very little data with which to evaluate his current environment and to plot his future. In comparison to his conclusions that he should survive, that he needs food and clothing and shelter, and that he needs affection, the aberrated culture into which he is born is often a very strange reality to him. Grown-ups have agreed upon this culture, but this agreement is not ordinarily the most sensible one which could be made. And the child is often faced with realities which are to him, dealing in the basics with which children deal, quite unreal. Thus, children are being disagreed with continually. The little baby believes it should have its own control of mest, that it should be permitted to crawl about at will, which is its command of space, that it should be able to take its own time about what it is doing, which is its conquest of time, that it should be able to expend energy in whichever direction it desires, which is its control of energy, and should be able to pull about and do as it pleases with matter, such as mud pies and precious vases on tables. The child does not have the evaluation that these things are held to be otherwise valuable in the society, and so the child is denied continually its conquest of mest. Nowhere is this denial as acute as in the denial of reality. None agrees, evidently, with the child, and thus, very early in life, a large number of locks begin to build up upon the basic engrams of the case. But disagreement with one's reality is not limited to childhood. Throughout life, the individual who has agreed with himself about certain realities is continually challenged in his reality by those about him, particularly those lower on the tone scale than himself, who seek to gain importance by reducing that individual's reality, and therefore reducing the individual on the tone scale to a point where he can be more easily controlled. Statements, then, which tend to invalidate a person's conclusions about reality concerning his own relationship to the culture and the environment are very aberrative. Inhibitions of communication are very common. They most ordinarily manifest themselves in this society with spectacles, with hearing aids, with tactile anesthesia, with stutterers, and people who will not write letters or pass along messages. Communication breaks on the inhibition side stem from the denial of a person's ability to see, to feel, to hear, to be, denial of a person's rights to talk or listen. In other words, denials of a person's right to communicate. These manifest themselves when underlain by engrams in terms of inhibited relations with one's fellows and a lowered position on the tone scale. The hurdy-gurdy system of straight wire takes into account all of the above data and puts into existence a method by which the auditor can exploit each person surrounding the pre-clear. We have already spoken of the triangle of Dianetics: affinity, reality, and communication. The auditor works on the principle that a datum desired from the pre-clear's memory today may not be forthcoming, but if requested again in a day or two, may be forthcoming, and if not then, may be available 2 or 3 days after that. The auditor then makes a list of all the persons who surrounded the pre-clear: father, mother, aunts, uncles, guardians, nurses, grandparents, great-grandparents, teachers, brothers, sisters, employers, and subordinates, as well as mates. 2 triangles and 2 circuit slots, straight lines, exist for each of these persons. The pre-clear does not need to know about this. The auditor can very simply draw up a plan of questioning, which then permits him, in his requests for memory of certain locks, to cover the ground over and over, and each time with new people, repeating questions asked about people covered in sessions before. In other words, this is a tally sheet, which the auditor could use in order to assay the case and blow, if possible, locks of enforced ARC, inhibited ARC, and circuits. For instance, the auditor draws 1 triangle and a slot for father, and he labels these enforced and dominating. Then he draws another triangle and another slot, and labels these inhibited and nullifying. Then he makes a similar graph for mother, and for every person intimately related to his pre-clear's life. See diagram of hurdy-gurdy system in the audiobook directory. His system of questioning, then, is to find out when Papa enforced affinity, when Papa enforced reality, when Papa commanded higher communication, and when Papa sought to dominate. He asks around the triangle and with the slot. He will discover that the pre-clear may or may not have certain immediate memories concerning Father's conduct and favorite phrases. The auditor then proceeds to the inhibition triangle and nullification slot. He asks when Father inhibited or refused affinity, when he inhibited or refused reality or agreement, when he inhibited or refused communication, and when and if Father attempted to nullify the pre-clear. In the same session, the auditor goes on to Mother and to other people with the same plan. Because the pre-clear's memory can be refreshed by this procedure, the auditor does not abandon Father after one session, but carries Father for 3 or 4 sessions on straight memory and asks a similar set of questions in the next session. When did Father enforce affinity, demand that he be loved, demand that he have affection shown to him? When did Father demand agreement? When did Father demand communication? When did Father attempt to dominate? When did Father attempt to cut off or inhibit affinity? When did Father attempt to cut off or inhibit reality? When did Father attempt to cut off or inhibit communication? When did Father attempt to nullify? The auditor then goes on to coverage of Mother or some other person. Systematized straight wire like this will turn up an enormous amount of material. The hurdy-gurdy system was created so that the auditor would not have to keep long sheets of questions. This is the general plan of questioning. The questions need not be the same every time, but their general import should include this plan. In such wise, the most aberrative forms of entheta and locks can be contacted by straight memory, and session after session, the pre-clear's material becomes fuller and his memory steadily improves. The valence problem is also resolvable in terms of straight memory. It often occurs that the pre-clear is suffering some physical disorder, which can be freed by straight memory along the following lines. Should the pre-clear have dermatitis of the hands, one might discover that some person in the pre-clear's background had dermatitis, or some ailment of or injury to the hands. This person may be located, and it may be discovered that some lock command exists which causes the pre-clear to be like the previously sick person. This is often found with a pre-clear who has lost an ally. Such a case is illustrative. The pre-clear's grandmother died of cancer of the hands. The pre-clear was suffering from dermatitis of the hands. It was discovered that many remarks had been made by relatives concerning how like his grandmother the pre-clear was. This likeness was so closely followed out by the pre-clear that he attempted to develop cancer of the hands, which manifested itself as dermatitis. The whole problem of valences is one of allies and antipathies. The pre-clear very often may be in the valence of someone who is normally hated. He is forced by lock commands, people telling him things like, "You're just like your father, you're growing more like him every day, and you'll grow up to be no good." Because of such commands, the pre-clear may not be able to help hating himself, since he is forced into the valence of a person who is hated and whom he hated. Straight memory can often resolve this problem merely by asking whom the pre-clear was most supposed to be like, and what was the general attitude toward this person. It is vital in straight memory to reach the actual context in the actual incident of every memory. The first stab of the pre-clear into his memory bank will be one of vague feeling that there was such an incident and that somebody said something like that. This is not good enough. The auditor must pin the pre-clear down to a specific incident and the words of that incident. If this is not possible in the first session, it will be possible in a succeeding session. Until it has been achieved, the lock will not be blown. A good trick to get a pre-clear to remember a specific incident is to ask the pre-clear if such an incident exists, and then, when he vaguely asserts that it must, to ask him where he was sitting when he heard somebody say this, or where he was standing. The pre-clear may quickly correct the auditor, saying that he was lying down or walking, and thus will have recovered data. There is a certain amount of challenge which the auditor can use in using straight memory. He puts the pre-clear on his mettle. If this is not carried too far, it acts as a very stimulating factor to the pre-clear. It is quite remarkable how many psychosomatic disorders and how many aberrations straight memory can resolve after the auditor has had a little practice. He can actually get his pre-clear out of some chronic valence, rid him of some aberration, bring him up to present time, and generally raise him on the tone scale merely by asking the right questions. The auditor should not confine himself to the hurdy-gurdy system of straight wire. This is only provided to relieve the maximum amount of N-theta in the minimum amount of auditor time. The auditor can use his imagination considerably with regard to what must have been said or done to this pre-clear. The auditor can profitably open any session by asking, "Well, what are you worried about today?" When the pre-clear tells him, the auditor wants to know who in the pre-clear's background might have thought that, and it sometimes results that the pre-clear can spot immediately what he has been told in the past which compares to the worry which he now has. And if the two are cause and effect, the pre-clear will immediately rid himself of the worry. It is quite remarkable how swiftly this can be done. When the pre-clear recovers a lock which has considerable N-theta on it, he ordinarily chuckles or smiles. The pre-clear who does not react in this fashion may yet be getting a little bit of N-theta off of the lock, but the possibility is that an earlier similar lock exists when the pre-clear does not laugh. Thus, when the pre-clear is caused to remember some early incident and yet does not experience any relief, although he should from the nature of the incident and its hidden character, the auditor does well to try to discover some earlier incident than the one remembered which is similar to it. The principle here is to discover, if possible, the key-in, the first time the underlying engram was restimulated. Straight memory is also used in order to discover a certain type of incident which can then be lock-scanned. The pre-clear who is directed to a certain type of circuit command in his case may not experience much relief through straight wire. But now that the auditor knows this type of circuit is in existence, he can cause the pre-clear to lock-scan the circuit, returning to the first time he can discover it and scanning up through all similar incidents to present time. Thus, straight memory is combined with lock scanning, which is actually a high-speed memory rather than a return through locks. No auditor should feel uncomfortable about using any quantity of straight memory. It will happen, however, that an auditor will get relief in the pre-clear by straight memory, then return the pre-clear down the track to an incident which is then run, and after bringing him back up the track will find that the relief which had been achieved before is now apparently gone. This comes about because a present-time lock has been laid in by returning. Merely having the pre-clear remember his own act of running the incident once he is back in present time should restore his aplomb and equilibrium. The benefits of straight memory are many. The duration of these benefits is in question. By straight memory of pleasure moments or of the first time one had a certain illness, one can alleviate headaches, stomach aches, worries, and anxieties. This does not mean that the effect is permanent, as would be the case when the basic engram is run out. But straight memory is the parlor trick of the auditor. In any group of people, he can always find at least one that he can make much happier simply by a few adroit questions. The auditor who uses straight memory for this purpose should also develop the technique of the marksman who, when he makes a bullseye, is clever enough immediately to lay aside the gun. Once the auditor has achieved a spectacular effect by straight memory, he should leave the case alone for that session, unless, of course, he is engaged in a regular progress up the tone scale with his pre-clear. Straight memory is a technique which should be studied and practiced with considerable alertness as to the good it can do. No auditor should fall into the rut of believing that simply remembering the past can do very much for the pre-clear. Remembering specific causative locks can, however, produce a marked change and improvement in an individual. Straight memory is not free association and is not random maundering. It is a precision technique and should be studied and used as such. Chapter 8, Column AD, Pleasure Moments. The Dianetic definition of pleasure is that the organism tending toward survival obtains pleasure by survival actions and the seeking of survival goals. In the organism below 2.0, tending toward death, a reactive pleasure is taken in the performance of acts which lead to succumbing on any of the dynamics. In other words, above 2.0, pleasure is survival, and below 2.0, pleasure is obtained only by succumbing or by bringing death to other entities or by causing self or other entities to be suppressed on the tone scale. True pleasure leads toward happiness. The pleasure which tends toward death is a reactive counterfeit, but seems intensely valid to those in the death bracket of the tone scale. Happiness could be said to be the overcoming of not unknowable obstacles toward a known and desirable goal. This postulates that the greatest happiness is the nearest approach to immortality. A good job, skilled abilities, bountiful harvests, possessions, these are goals. There are very finite goals for the happy man in every day of the week, as well as the big goals toward which he directs his efforts. His happiness does not come from the attainment of the goals, but from overcoming obstacles on the way to those goals. Pleasure and immortality are near synonyms for individuals above 2.0 on the tone scale. There is a gradient scale of the types of pleasure enjoyed by those above 2.0. It seems evident that the person at 2.5 actually takes pleasure in being bored, but surges up toward higher levels when interest is concentrated on some goal not outside the understanding of the 2.5. The 3.0 takes pleasure in reaching toward very clearly observable goals. The 3.0 accepts his pleasure cautiously and tentatively, but nevertheless enjoys it. His pleasures are apt to be routine and relatively unimaginative. The 3.5 tends toward higher goals of survival and has confidence in reaching those goals. He can embrace more bountiful levels of survival. He can realize that survival as a bare necessity level process is unsafe and intolerable, and that if all computations demonstrate that he will require 2 bushels of wheat per month to eat, then he had better provide 20 bushels of wheat per month. His pleasure is wide and ambitious. The 4.0 achieves considerable exhilaration. His concept of survival is so bountiful, and he is yet so confident of his ability to reach such levels of survival, that he can take in a universe of goals and, within the limits of his skills and talents, accomplish them. Here we have a definite manifestation of attitudes toward goals, magnitudes of goals, and the ability to attain and enjoy pleasure. No man is happy without a goal, and no man can be happy without faith in his own ability to reach that goal. The highest form of security is confidence in one's self, in the future, in the group, and in mankind. Without such confidence and without the will to make the various dynamics survive, an individual has no security. That person who measures his security in terms of a good job purposely short-sights himself as to the actual insecurity of his position. A man who works for an organization which may endure long or may be transient, according to popular indoctrination, is secure. And yet he may work to the period of his life when he is no longer adaptable and find himself of a sudden without any job because of the simple sudden shift of a board of directors or because of the antagonism of a foreman. Security would consist of this man's being able to adapt himself to his environment, being prepared for any possible shift in the factors which influence his job, and being confident of his ability to meet and deal with any possible shifts. Security is not a static thing. Security would only lie in a man's confidence in reaching his goals, and indeed in his having goals to reach. There are automatic goals inherent in the plan of life. The conquest of Mest, the survival of the Theta body, faith in immortality, and the Supreme Being are all high-level automatic goals. They potentially exist in anyone, but the amount of N-theta inherent in the Theta body and accumulated within the generation may cause the individual or the group to fall far short of any realization of its ability to attain these goals. The more N-theta existing in the Theta body and accumulated in the generation, the lower or less reasonable will be the goals of the individual or group. Without goals, hopes, ambitions, or dreams, the attainment of pleasure is nearly impossible. Many individuals do not realize this, and even though capable of assigning to themselves goals and pursuing those goals, they permit lower-toned people around them not only to undermine their confidence in their own ability to attain security and survival, but also to deny them the right to formulate and strive toward goals of a desirable magnitude. At the lower levels of the tone scale, one finds individuals who purposely interbulate, upset, destroy, and with great ardor inhibit the goals, hopes, and dreams of those about them. Here we have the individuals from 2.0 down. These have goals which are themselves no less definite than the survival goals above 2.0. It is a piteous and terrible thing that individuals above 2.0 expend vast amounts of coaxings and persuasions on mates, associates, and fellow group members below 2.0 in an effort to get them to go toward survival goals. Individuals who engage in this activity are immediately targets for those who exist from 2.0 down, since these see in the higher individuals a method of furthering their own goals, and the goal of the 2.0 down is death. An examination of the anatomy of death demonstrates that death can be a small or a great thing. Death is actually a gradient scale. Small mishaps and accidents can tend toward greater and greater accumulation of mishaps and accidents until death of an ambition, death of an individual, death of a cause, or death of a group is attained. Here is the story. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the battle was lost. And all for the want of a horseshoe nail. Death stems from small things and proceeds toward great things. Death is a soft-footed thing. Today, a man makes a flagrant error in bookkeeping. He makes it because his wife has nagged him the night before. Tomorrow, his superior finds the error and marks it down that this bookkeeper is not always accurate. In itself, this is nothing. But next month, when a bookkeeper has to be discharged, it is recalled that one made an error, and, all other abilities being more or less equal among bookkeepers, the one who made the error is discharged. Out of a job, the bookkeeper finds himself even more enturbulated at home and spends little time finding new employment. He takes a job beneath his skill in an office where everything is hectic, and he makes more mistakes because he is now worried. This is a little bit of death. There are those who talk about lucky breaks and who speak of the hand of fate in their undertakings, but a forthright examination of the field of man's activities will show that nearly all success is most adequately deserved. The head of an imposing institute of psychology in a major American city told me recently that when he first entered upon his profession, he was to some degree convinced that the capitalist, the big industrial manager, the director of the great corporation, had arrived where he was because of carelessness of the feelings of others and avarice. In the course of the many ensuing years, he had, however, either with his own hand or through his staff, done industrial psychometric testing of many organizations, and with this work had had an opportunity to test a great many of the capitalists, managers, directors, and industrial giants of America. He had found in every case that those who were at the top very well deserved to be there. He had discovered that the endowment of these individuals included a rich appreciation of life, a great feeling for their fellow men, an enormous persistence, and intelligence in planning and execution. He had discovered that the world is carried on the backs of a few desperate but very big men, and he had discovered that luck was not chance. Individuals above 2.0 on the tone scale are uniformly lucky. There is something more to theta than quite meets the eye. Here are the men on whom God smiles. Below 2.0 we have the unlucky. One could, with some surety, give to a person high on the tone scale a few dollars and expect him to come out a winner at Las Vegas. And one could expect that the same few dollars given to a person low on the tone scale would see him coming out of the game very much the loser. Above 2.0, the individual plays to win. Below 2.0, the individual uniformly plays to lose. And not only does the individual below 2.0 play to lose for himself, he plays to lose for everyone else around him and for the future. It is part of the mechanism of death that individuals below 2.0 talk as though they play to win, talk of the desperate need of saving and winning, talk of emergencies by which one is expected to win. This is all a part of the trap. Given every opportunity and every facility and every circumstance by which they can win, people below 2.0 will inject into every plan the germ of death, and, acting ever so reasonably, will permit that germ to grow until death is attained for the individual, for his associates, for the future, or for his organization. A Hitler brays his anger at the world and hounds all Germany into action with the argument of glory, and yet brings, through not very mysterious mistakes, the hopes of Germany to death. He makes a charnel house of Europe, slaughters 30 million human beings, brings suicide to himself and the extinction of hopes to his German nation. Yet many times in the course of Hitler's 1.5 activities, he could have converted Germany into the glory of the world. As a matter of fact, before he began to manufacture nothing but munitions, he had revived German science to a point where it was respected above the science of any other nation. And by the simple and direct appeal that Germany had become vital to the survival of other nations, Germany could have risen and become glorious. But at no time when Germany could have risen did Hitler take the turning toward survival. He chose instead the turning toward death. This play is not enacted always upon the stage of nations. It happens in many households. It is a pathetic and terrible thing to find a man mated with an individual below 2.0. He does everything he can to succeed, and yet at every turn of his career he finds himself balked by some strange non-compliance or some new enturbulation. And gradually, little by little, his energies decline until he himself is outward bound toward death and a new generation. A woman mating herself to a man below 2.0, who is herself capable of a high level of survival, will find herself broken by little misunderstandings, strange perversions, and quarrels at inopportune times, until at last her ambitions for a family and a future, or even for a career for herself, lie in the dust where so many dreams go. The man who takes unto himself a business partner below 2.0, who is himself well above that line, will find a strange concatenation of events building around him which bring about the destruction of that business, regardless of the hopes with which it was founded, and regardless of his own ability to carry it through. It would be far, far better for an individual engaging in a marriage, a business, or a group action to inject himself with the most deadly poison or virulent bacteria than to ally himself with anyone below 2.0 on the tone scale. If this seems strong, look around you at the blasted men, the blasted dreams, the stories never written, the songs never sung, because someone, out of some pap of sympathy or obligation, allied himself with an individual below 2.0 on the tone scale. This is death. Death as certain as laying one's neck below the blade of a guillotine and tripping the trigger. From 2.0 down, the individual takes a reactive but very definite pleasure in attaining the goal of death for himself, for the future, and for individuals around him. Here is N Theta seeking to separate Theta from Mest to bring about death and to accomplish a new generation. In the vicinity of such people, death may be silent and waiting, but ready to influence and pervert every action in the direction of succumb. At 2.0, the individual finds a reactive pleasure in sending forth antagonisms, in carping and nagging and criticizing. Left at liberty, he will not sink any further on the tone scale, but will continue to abreact his hostilities. He is dramatizing engrams, but should these dramatizations be broken, he will descend on the tone scale. It is an actual fact that whatever pleasure he obtains is obtained through these dramatizations. He can, by processing or education or changed environment, be brought up the tone scale, but left where he is, he will certainly drag others down it, since he is a point of turbulence, as are all people below 2.0. At 1.5, the individual finds reactive pleasure only in the venting of anger. He has no actual concept of pleasure, but he gains a feeling of dangerousness, and therefore of pleasure, in the dramatization of his dominating or angry engrams. If permitted to go on being angry, he will remain static to some degree on the tone scale. But if these dramatizations are balked or fought against, he will descend down the tone scale, since he is not permitted to experience the pleasure which he can attain by being angry. It should not be expected that reasonable causes must exist for this person to vent anger. This person will make his own causes so that he can be angry. His goal is to achieve destruction of things or people. He has considerable joy in achieving that destruction. People who are only temporarily at the 1.5 level, which is to say, who are being acutely 1.5, know well the satisfaction obtained in smashing something. The chronic 1.5 can rise no higher than the smashing of things. At times in the past, it has been felt that the individual who threw things, who went into a rage, and who talked in desperately destructive terms was at the lowest possible depth of insanity. This is very far from true. This is the very high bracket of insanity. One should beware of those who are lower on the tone scale and who bring about destruction only by covert means, for there is no forewarning of what they will do. Any pre-clear whose reactive mind, and all reactive minds are below 2.0 on the tone scale, is coming up toward a release will pass through the zone of anger reactively and will be furious with people who have done things to him and may even be furious at the world at large. This is a symptom of his getting well and not a symptom of his going mad. People are not easier to handle below the zone of anger. People below the zone of anger are much more dangerous, since they will take much wider steps to bring about death. They do not bring about destruction in clean daylight, as does the angry individual, but in the dark alleys and cesspools of humanity. The person who is chronically angry can be processed rather easily by Dianetics up into the higher tones, since he still retains his vitality. It is only necessary for him to discover those things about which he is really angry, in order for him to centralize and focus his attention, and he still has considerable theta with which to convert n-theta. But, and never neglected, this person's pleasure is in being angry, and in running pleasure moments, one had best discover moments in which the individual could be unreservedly angry at something. The 1.1 tends even more markedly toward death than the outspokenly angry individual. The 1.1 will make small slips and errors, and bring about upset and turmoil in his vicinity with considerable aplomb. These are his joys. If the 1.1 is to experience any pleasure, it will be in an act which is deviously and hiddenly destructive to himself, to the future, to his group, or to mankind, to life itself, to theta, or even, although that is impossible, the Supreme Being. It should be understood that an individual may have a 1.1 reactive mind, and yet be quite analytically alert and only drop to 1.1 when he is enturbulated. This would be an acute 1.1, but such a person is still dangerous. With the smoothest possible face, the 1.1 can deny any and every destructive or death act which he or she has engaged upon. The 1.1 hides all destructive acts, and quite commonly puts a face of construction upon these activities. The 1.1 finds pleasure in sex only if sex is engaged upon with many people and in strange and peculiar ways. This does not contradict the fact that a man, like any male, may seek to own and impregnate as many females as possible, not a 1.1 characteristic. The 1.1 does not enjoy sex, save only when it is hectic and inturbulative. Here is the satyr, the nymphomaniac. The 1.1 will injure or maim animals or men for pleasure. And in running pleasure moments on the 1.1, the auditor will find such moments existing around the injury of somebody's dreams or the body of some helpless being. Here, pleasure is obtained not in the clean daylight, but clandestinely and often hideously. The 1.5 takes pleasure in bringing about the incapacity of a powerful enemy. The 1.1 takes pleasure in breaking his enemy's back while the enemy lies wounded and helpless. The 1.1 may appear appealing. He may make a great show of his powerlessness. But when the lights are dimmed, the actions of this individual are directed energetically toward death, whether the death of a reputation, the death of a cause, even though the cause is apparently supported, or the death of himself, no matter how far he seems to think his actions are from suicide. In the 1.1 band, by the way, we find the individual most blatantly insistent upon ethics and morals for others. The 0.5, being that much further toward succumbing and dying, attempts to bring about the death of his family, associates, and self by continual forthright turbulence in terms of death. Truth is, of course, no consideration at any level below 2.0. The most flagrantly untruthful is the apathy level of 0.5. The individual at 0.5 obtains reactive pleasure in lying wildly but dolorously about the hopelessness and horribleness of life and what has been done to him. To run what any individual at an acceptable level of the tone scale would consider a pleasure moment on a person at 0.5 is, of course, all but impossible. But reactive pleasure can be obtained by the 0.5 in being as thoroughly 0.5 as possible. The 0.1 can sometimes be coaxed into running a pleasure moment on the subject of how dead he is and how lacking in any dangerousness. If the auditor can contact him at all, it will be at this level where the pleasure moments can be found. It is a general rule, then, that pleasure moments are run at the level where the individual finds himself on the tone scale. Do not expect the 2.5 to run moments of high exhilaration, since the n-theta on his case prevents him from reaching such a level. Do not expect the 1.1 to run a moment when he was extremely angry, since his position on the tone scale makes overt anger a very dangerous thing to indulge in, and the fear implicit in his position may prevent him from showing it. However, if you can get him to recall a moment when he was outstandingly and admirably moral and ethical when all around him were being dishonest and insincere, you may find that he experiences a great deal of pleasure in this counterfeit situation. The general rule is that above 2.0, the auditor discovers constructive and creative acts of greater and greater triumph and magnitude as the pre-clear rises up the tone scale. And below 2.0, he finds greater and greater efforts toward death in the pleasure moments chosen by his pre-clear. In any case, it is overcoming obstacles toward the goal which is important to pleasure. Below 2.0, of course, the individual is overcoming obstacles which tell him to survive as he travels toward his goal of death. Death to individuals below 2.0 is the only valid and obtainable goal, whether for self, future, group, or mankind. Anything which interrupts this course toward the goal of non-survival will be fought by people below 2.0. Such avidity for extinction is commendable only for the thoroughness with which these individuals will struggle to die. Because one deals here with 8 dynamics, one should not believe that the individual below 2.0 works only toward his own death. At 2.0, he works rather mildly toward the death of a very wide periphery, but does not much desire death for himself. At 1.5, he works toward the death of other beings or life forms or other dynamics. He will, of course, bring about death for self, but he does not give heed to this. One cannot reduce the other dynamics without reducing the first dynamic of self and bringing about one's own death. At 1.1, we get only an occasional conscious awareness that the individual is himself tending toward his own suicide. Death is intended by devious means for a lesser periphery. Where the 1.5 will seek the death of many, the 1.1 will seek by covert means the death of a few. The 0.5 seeks death in obverse ratio to the amount of attention he can give to his environ, and that attention is normally isolated in the first dynamic, and may include only a few intimates in the environ. The 0.5, then, is the suicide, but before suicide, can almost be counted upon to attempt the death of at least his closest associate, whether by murder or by interbulation via sympathy. Occasionally, the 0.5 will include the murder of children as a part of personal suicide. The intimate of a 0.5 stands actually in the gravest peril in which an individual can possibly stand. The general running of pleasure moments can accomplish a very great deal in a case. There is the case of an elderly woman who had no other kind of processing done on her for many weeks. She was, at the beginning of this period, according to report, bedridden. An auditor with an experimental inclination spent 2 hours a day running pleasure moments with this person, petty triumphs, joyous meetings, moments of good health and well-being, moments of pride in accomplishment or in loved ones. At the end of this period, the elderly woman was no longer bedridden and evidenced a considerable rise on the tone scale. Not a single lock, secondary, or engram was run on the case. This should give the auditor some idea of the value of pleasure as a target for processing. There is also the case of a person who could run no grief until pleasure moments were scanned intensively on his case. Such contact with the fact that pleasure actually existed in his life enabled him to support, because of the free theta return to him through the attraction of his attention to pleasure moments, the contact with moments of misemotion necessary to free his case. Pleasure moments seem to say, first and foremost, that survival is possible, but below 2.0, pleasure moments give the encouragement that death is possible. In either case, the tone is raised whether the pre-clear desires it or not. The running of pleasure moments is done exactly as one would run an engram or a secondary engram. One requires the pre-clear to return to the moment when the pleasure was actually taking place and to contact all the perceptics of the incident, seeing and hearing and feeling the experience as fully as possible over and over. The pre-clear can run the incident many times before tiring of it, since at each running he should discover new instants and perceptics that had been hidden before. Running pleasure in this way seems markedly to increase the amount of free theta in the case. On lower levels of the tone scale, actual pleasure in a person's life, moments of survival, particularly those of triumph, are not easily obtainable. However, the auditor, by having the pre-clear run possible pleasure moments as concepts, and then as they are contacted more closely as actual incidents, can possibly demonstrate to the pre-clear that pleasure has existed and is available. In view of the fact that obtaining pleasure is one of the primary goals of life, the running of pleasure moments can do a very great deal for a case. There have been cases which have had Sonic and Visio turn on merely by the running of pleasure moments. The case is most readily stabilized by the running of pleasure moments. One should run several pleasure moments if the case is difficult to stabilize in present time. After running such moments, the pre-clear often comes easily to present time, having recovered attention units from secondaries and engrams somewhat restimulated in processing. Memory itself can be refreshed just by running on the track. One can, as an experiment, choose some specific date in the pre-clear's lifetime. This date may be completely occluded, but the auditor insists that the pre-clear return to this date. The pre-clear may be completely in the dark as to what happened on, let us say, January 3rd, 1943. The auditor has the advantage over the pre-clear, since he knows that when he has told the pre-clear to go to a certain date, then the pre-clear has gone there whether the pre-clear knows it or not. The auditor then requires the recounting of the happenstances of, say, 9:30 a.m. on that date. The pre-clear may be able, foggily, to point out certain incidents in the year 1943. If the auditor is very patient and persistent in his address, he will gradually cause the eye of the pre-clear to obtain the specific details of the date and moment, and he can then run this moment with its own actual perceptics. This is no less valid a technique than running pleasure moments. The mind has recorded everything, and the auditor knows that when he sends the pre-clear back to such and such a time, the pre-clear is there even though the eye of the pre-clear may be barred from the perceptics of the incident by n theta on the case. With patience and persistence, the auditor can always obtain the data which he requires. Moments of triumph are, of course, pleasure moments, but one often finds pre-clears, particularly those below 3.0 on the tone scale, who run pleasure moments without experiencing any pleasure from them. The auditor may find the pre-clear winning a silver cup at a horse show, and the auditor may return the pre-clear to the incident and run him through it over and over, only to discover that the pre-clear felt he did not deserve to win the cup. This is the difference between the pre-clear's concept of reality and the auditor's concept of reality. By all reason, the pre-clear should have obtained pleasure in winning this silver cup at the horse show. But, in accordance with the pre-clear's tone, no pleasure was obtained from the incident, since possibly it brought about too much notice and notoriety, or it conflicted badly with some specific engrammic computation of the pre-clear about winning or about hurting the other contestants by having won. This should not discourage the auditor. It should only point out to him that he is attempting to run pleasure moments too high up the tone scale for his pre-clear. In such a case, the auditor should go down the tone scale and find a time, perhaps, when the pre-clear was able to destroy the reputation of some dear friend by some lying gossip and run this as a pleasure moment. He will obtain, in such wise, despite the pre-clear's feeling that it is impossible, a rise in tone. The auditor should not neglect the fact that pleasure moments may be created, and that a present-time pleasure moment is itself a point on the track and will tend to disinterbulate the pre-clear. This does not mean that the auditor should countenance the pleasure that would be sought by some individuals low on the tone scale, pleasure which might consist of the destruction of the reputation, future, or health of some young woman or child, but it does mean that the auditor should encourage the pre-clear to provide himself with pleasure as an assist to processing. The auditor, if he is advising pleasure, should not fall into the old error of believing that pleasure is idleness and wastefulness. The greatest pleasure, for instance, that a composer can achieve is in composing. A genius in management achieves his greatest pleasure in overcoming obstacles to management. The best pleasure for an individual is in the attainment of happiness, the overcoming of not unknowable obstacles toward a known goal. The auditor may, by adroit questioning, discover for the pre-clear the fact that he has goals toward which he can proceed. It is a below 2.0 trick to take a creative and constructive individual and set him aside from the root of his greatest pleasure, which may be the pursuance of highly arduous goals. The auditor would not tell a mountaineer to go to the seashore for a rest, but should encourage the mountaineer in the belief that he can conquer a much higher mountain than he has ever attained before, since if his mountaineer is ailing, it is because some less than 2.0 individual in his vicinity has brought him, by great and detailed discouragements, to the belief that he can climb no more mountains. Pleasure, whether for life or death, is attainment or the overcoming of obstacles toward that attainment. When running pleasure moments or when advising his pre-clear to create and construct present-time pleasure moments to raise his level on the tone scale, the auditor should not overlook the fact that happiness is the overcoming of not unknowable obstacles toward a known goal. He will find the majority of his pre-clears without any goals. The auditor, by questioning and without interfering with the self-determinism of his pre-clears, can help them to discover and clarify their goals. Or he can assist in the identification of obstacles toward any goal which the pre-clear already recognizes. Or the auditor can simply encourage the pre-clear to keep on overcoming the known obstacles toward his known goals. The auditor will discover pre-clears who are not particularly low on the tone scale, who have yet had insufficient opportunities to experience pleasure, and so have behind them a barren life. An auditor is justified in advising the pre-clear to go out and create and live through a pleasure moment so that the auditor afterwards can run it to the enhancement of the case. The living of it, of course, is more important than the running. The primary consideration is whether or not pleasure moments exist. It is interesting to note that any society declines in exact ratio to the contempt in which it holds pleasure and advances in ratio to the respect it has for pleasure. Above 2.0, pleasure contains more construction than destruction, more good than evil. Below 2.0, pleasure contains more destruction than construction, more evil than good. Immorality comes about when a thing contains more pain than it does pleasure. Societies have existed which found their pleasure in observing or inflicting more evil than good. The Roman circus is an example of this and marked a point in the decline of the Roman Empire which forecast an early death for that great political organization. By true pleasure is meant acts which contain more good than evil. Before one condemns pleasure, one should understand the kind of pleasure about which a person is talking. But there happens to have been, down through the centuries, such a revulsion toward what the Roman Empire called pleasure in the early Christian days, that pleasure itself became inhibited. There are individuals and groups which consider the enjoyment of life a crime. This immediately and automatically spots these individuals and groups on the tone scale. They are below 2.0 and are headed toward succumb. Yet the auditor will have to cope with people who have been indoctrinated into an inhibition of pleasure and who by education are unable to experience pleasure. The auditor should have ready his definitions of pleasure and an understanding of what pleasure actually is. From those who tell him that pleasure is evil, he should gain a definition of what they think is enjoyable. This is the type of incident which can be run on the case as a pleasure moment. For those who tell him that pleasure is good and then proceed to detail promiscuity and sadism, the auditor should have at least an intellectual understanding. Because of the various situations which exist in the life of any person, pleasure as survival and pleasure as death sometimes intermingle. It occasionally happens that some individual has lost through the chicanery, treachery, or betrayal of others his woman, his business, or his reputation, and his idea of pleasure is the painful extinction of those who have injured him. This does not immediately denote a low position on the tone scale, for the auditor may find that such an individual delves into death for only one circumstance. If the other circumstances of the individual are high on the scale, the auditor should recognize an immediate indication of where he should work in order to free considerable theta which is tied up in plots of revenge and dreams of painful punishment for the enemy. Such an individual, however, can ordinarily run pleasure in other spheres of life. Even a low-toned individual can sometimes find some sphere of activity, if very isolated, which is constructive, and thus the auditor knows where to look for actual pleasure on the case, and can use this particular incident or type of incident in order to free theta. The whole subject of pleasure moments is allied intimately with survival, where true pleasure is concerned. The auditor, however, should not overlook the fact that it is pleasure for the 0.5 to contemplate the most gruesome possible suicide or the most pathetic death of the nearest loved one. The auditor should not be critical of the type of pleasure which his pre-clear selects, but should work continually to select the highest possible pleasure on the tone scale available to his pre-clear. In other words, for the 1.1, he should try to find 1.5 or 2.0 or 2.5 pleasures rather than persisting along the line of 1.1. The auditor is attempting to raise the pre-clear up the tone scale, and in the process of doing so, he will find that higher and higher levels of pleasure can be obtained not only in present time, but in the past. The amount of pleasure of the true variety which the pre-clear can experience or run is symptomatic not only of his chronic position on the scale, but of his progressive rise toward more desirable levels. Positive processing. A variation of technique which is of value to the auditor is positive processing. This consists of addressing the theta on the case and bringing it to view. The auditor may become so engrossed in addressing n theta directly that he may overlook the fact that theta may be buried under the n theta. By looking for and bringing to view the theta, a pre-clear may be considerably improved in tone. Below many areas of n theta on a track, there may be what we could call deposits of theta. The theta of the auditor and pre-clear addressed to such deposits of theta will disinterbulate the n theta, which may overlay such a moment. Pleasure moments are, one could say, deposits of theta. Such deposits assist the conversion of n theta to theta. The running of pleasure moments, then, materially assists the raising of tone. One can use this in many ways, and all these ways could be grouped under positive processing. There are probably innumerable variations of positive processing. The running of a pleasure moment, just as though it were an engram until all perceptics are recovered, is just one instance of positive processing. The scanning of chains of pleasure moments is another variation. The running of future pleasure moments ties in the imagination, but is just another variation of positive processing. Affinity, reality, and communication can be used to excellent advantage in positive processing. The auditor in this instance is not looking for ARC locks when ARC was enforced or inhibited. He is looking for moments when they existed. By straight memory, the auditor causes the pre-clear to recall moments when he actually felt he was receiving or giving affinity or communication or actually experiencing reality. The pre-clear fairly well down the scale may have to search for some time before he can recall an instance when he actually felt affinity for something or some person or actually felt he was receiving affinity. Similarly, the pre-clear may have difficulty finding a moment of actual communication. He may be in an audience or talking with a friend or even simply talking to a dog. Further, the auditor should remember that communication extends to perception and that actually seeing something or recalling that something was heard or felt may discover a theta deposit. Causing the pre-clear to recall something he knew was truly real or even recall somebody agreeing thoroughly with him is another instance of positive processing. Straight memory on ARC positives is very valuable on low-tone cases. Further, it is valuable in any case as a means of ending a session. The auditor will find sometimes that when he gives positive processing, he will get yawns from the pre-clear. This is particularly true of scanning pleasure moments. These yawns indicate that the pre-clear has pleasure suppressors, that something makes him feel guilty for experiencing pleasure. By some standards, not survival ones, pleasure is seen to be wicked, and the engrams of the pre-clear will be found to contain admonitions against pleasure. Occasionally, the auditor will find a pre-clear breaking into tears under positive processing. Here, evidently, though several opinions could be advanced, the suppression of pleasure is such that the overlying n theta is of the same value as that in a secondary engram. The tears of relief signify the progress of the pre-clear up from apathy through grief in certain incidents. For any incident, irrespective of the pre-clear's tone, has its own position on the tone scale, and, as it is reduced, comes up the scale in stages. There was once a whole philosophy devoted to pleasure, hedonism. Survival is pleasure, but idle satisfaction of the senses without plan or progress toward any goal is itself, like Aesop's grasshopper, destructive in the long run. It was this idle and purposeless gratification of the senses at which the moralist raged, and with considerable justification. But better terminology should have been used. Pleasure is something neither man nor a civilization can do without. Its omission results in succumb. In that happiness can be found to be the overcoming of not unknowable obstacles toward a known goal, or the contemplation of goals, one can see that idle pleasure would have to be static or destructive sensual gratification. Pleasure is seldom idle in that sense, but it is as often lazy and relaxing as it is dynamic and constructive. Man cannot live without it, and the auditor, using positive processing, will find it a helpful ally.